Yoon Hae-rin didn't flinch when she heard the front door open. She was sitting at Amara's marble kitchen island, wearing Amara's champagne silk robe, drinking from Amara's favorite porcelain cup, her bare feet tucked beneath her like she owned every inch of the floor she was resting on. She looked up slowly when Amara walked in, not startled, not ashamed, almost curious the way someone looks at an inconvenient guest who arrived too early to a party that was already theirs. That was the moment. Not the robe, not the cup, not even the unfamiliar perfume that had hit Amara in the corridor 30 seconds earlier. It was the way Hae-rin looked at her, like Amara was the one who didn't belong. 9 years of marriage, 4 seconds to understand all of it. If you've ever stood in a room that used to be yours and felt like the stranger, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and drop your city and country in the comments so I can see exactly how far this story travels. Because what happens next will make you question everything you think you know about love, silence, and the moment a woman finally decides she's done disappearing. The flight from Tokyo landed 40 minutes ahead of schedule. That was the detail no one planned for. Not the household staff, not the security team at the gate, and certainly not Seong-hwan, who was supposed to have the entire evening to rearrange whatever it was that needed rearranging inside their home before his wife returned. Amara noticed the gate guard's face first. She'd been living inside Seong-hwan's world long enough to read the people who worked the edges of it, the ones whose jobs depended on being invisible and whose faces, under real pressure, gave away everything their mouths would never say. The young man who buzzed her through the estate's main entrance couldn't hold eye contact for more than a second. He looked at her chin, then at the ground, then at the security panel, like it had suddenly developed an urgent problem requiring his full attention. Amara didn't say anything. She noticed. The car pulled along the curved private driveway, and she stepped out before the driver finished opening her door. The autumn air in Hanam-dong had a particular weight to it, the kind of cold that arrives after dark and settles into the bones without announcing itself. She'd lived in Seoul long enough that it no longer felt foreign. Just heavy. The mansion's main entrance was unlocked. The housekeeper, Mrs. Cho, who had worked for Seong-hwan's family for 11 years and who treated every crack in the building's composure as a personal failure, was standing at the far end of the entrance hall with her hands folded in front of her and her eyes aimed at a spot approximately 6 inches above the floor tile. Not at Amara, not at the door, somewhere in between, as though she was hoping to disappear into the neutral space. Mrs. Kwan. Her voice came out flat and careful, the way voices sound when someone has been coached into a particular tone and is concentrating hard on maintaining it. Mrs. Cho, Amara said, "Is my husband home?" A pause just long enough to be its own answer. "He arrived approximately 2 hours ago, ma'am." Amara set her travel bag down near the console table and straightened. She noticed a second pair of shoes near the door. Women's. Low-heeled, nothing she recognized. "Thank you," Amara said. She walked toward the kitchen. The perfume reached her first, something she didn't own, light and synthetic and unmistakably young. She slowed without stopping, taking 3 more steps before she appeared in the kitchen doorway and saw what was waiting for her on the other side of the marble island. Yoon Hae-rin was 28 years old, and she had worked as Seong-hwan's executive secretary for the past 3 years. Amara had met her precisely 4 times. Office parties. A charity event. Once in the lobby of Seong-hwan's downtown tower, briefly while signing for a package delivery that had been misrouted to the building. Hae-rin had smiled at her on all 4 occasions with the particular politeness of someone who has already made a decision and simply hasn't announced it yet. She wasn't smiling now. She wasn't particularly anything. She sat at Amara's kitchen island with one elbow on the marble, and Amara's champagne silk robe tied loosely at her waist, and she held Amara's favorite porcelain cup with both hands like it was something she'd been given, not something she'd taken. Her hair was loose. She looked well-rested. She looked like someone who had grown comfortable enough to stop performing. The cup was the thing that broke something in Amara's chest. Not the robe. You could rationalize a robe. Maybe she spilled something. Maybe it was just hanging nearby. Maybe there was some chain of circumstances that made the garment make neutral sense. But the cup was the one Amara had carried from a ceramic studio in Osaka 3 years ago, a morning trip she'd taken alone because Seong-hwan had a last-minute meeting. A cup she'd wrapped in a scarf inside her suitcase and transported back to Seoul by herself. A cup she used every single morning because it was the one ordinary object in a 7,000-square-foot house she felt had been chosen entirely by her. Hae-rin was drinking from it like she'd used it before. "I think," Amara said, and her voice came out quieter than she expected, not trembling. "Just compressed, you should put that down." Hae-rin set the cup on the marble. She didn't look embarrassed. If anything, she looked like someone who had run through this moment in her mind often enough that the actual version felt manageable. "Mrs. Kwan, don't." Amara's voice stayed quiet. "Just don't." She stood in the kitchen doorway for another 4 seconds. She could count them. She'd remember counting them later, alone in Danielle's apartment, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand why her first instinct had not been to shout or throw something or demand an explanation, but to simply take inventory: the robe, the cup, the shoes by the door, Mrs. Cho's carefully controlled face, chose carefully as though some part of her brain had already been preparing for this moment and just needed the sensory confirmation to close the file. Then she turned and went upstairs. She didn't run. She was not going to run inside her own home. The thought arrived cleanly, and she held on to it, her own home, aware, even as she thought it, of the particular irony embedded in that word. Her own home. The home that had been designed by Seong-hwan's architect, furnished according to Seong-hwan's tastes, staffed by people who answered ultimately to Seong-hwan, located in a district of Seoul, where everything from the gate locks to the stone wall surrounding the property communicated ownership, specifically Kwan Seong-hwan's ownership, of which Amara had been, for 9 years, one more carefully maintained item. She pulled her suitcase from the top shelf of the walk-in closet before she fully registered the decision to do it. Her hands moved on their own. Black suitcase, the one she'd used for the Tokyo trip, still half-packed, which made the work faster. She started adding things with the focused efficiency of someone managing a task rather than a collapse undergarments. A second pair of shoes, the charcoal wool dress she'd bought before marrying Seong-hwan and never worn, because somehow the right occasion had never come. Her grandmother's watch from the bedside table, the composition notebook she kept in the drawer beneath her side of the bed. She heard him on the stairs. Seong-hwan's footsteps had a particular cadence, heavier on the right, slightly quicker on the landing, a pattern she'd learned to recognize from across the house, the way you learn to recognize the sound of someone you've slept next to for almost a decade. She heard him pause at the bedroom door before he knocked, which told her that Hae-rin had said something to him in the kitchen, which told her that the woman had composed herself faster than most people could. Amara. She didn't answer. She folded a sweater. He opened the door. He was still in his work, clothes, dark suit, no tie, collar button, undone the way he always loosened it in the car on the way home. He looked, she thought, distantly like himself. That was the thing. He didn't look like someone who had done something. He looked exactly like the man she'd handed 9 years of her life to, which was somehow worse than if he had looked different. "Amara, I don't need an explanation." She didn't stop folding. "I'm not asking for one." "Then what are you doing?" She gestured at the suitcase with one hand. The answer seemed obvious enough that narrating it felt beneath both of them. "That's not—" He stopped. Started again. "Where are you going to go?" "Danielle's." "I can." She picked up the composition notebook. "I am." Seong-hwan stood in the doorway, and she could hear him pulling together the version of himself that had gotten him through every difficult negotiation, every backroom confrontation, every moment where a powerful man needed to appear unshakable. She'd watched him do it hundreds of times at dinner parties and boardroom meetings and family gatherings, where his mother said something that landed badly. He had a way of going very still and very measured, and normally it worked, and normally the room shifted toward him. She wasn't going to shift. Amara. She didn't. It was he stopped again. Something that might have been frustration crossed his face. Or maybe it was something closer to shame. Hard to tell with Seong-hwan because shame didn't sit naturally on him, and his face didn't know what to do with it. It wasn't what it looked like. Amara picked up her wedding ring from the small tray on her side of the dresser. She turned it once in her fingers. She'd bought this ring herself. Actually, she'd walked into the jeweler with Seong-hwan, but she'd pointed to the one she wanted, simple and thin and white gold, because Seong-hwan's first instinct had been something with a much larger stone that would have felt like a declaration rather than a marriage. She set the ring down on top of his dresser, not thrown, placed. "I'm not running away from you, Seong-hwan." She zipped the suitcase. The sound of it felt very loud in the room. "I'm going back to myself." She picked up the bag. He didn't move out of the doorway immediately. There was a half second where his body clearly hadn't decided whether to step aside or stay, and then he stepped aside. She thought afterward that it might have been the most honest thing he did all evening, that instinctive half step that admitted he had no ground to hold. She walked down the stairs, past Mrs. Cho, who was still standing in the entrance hall with her folded hands and her carefully arranged non-expression, past the console table and her travel bag, which she picked up without stopping, past the shoes near the door that didn't belong to anyone she'd invited into the house. The gate guard buzzed her out without looking at her face. She walked through the gate that hundreds of men feared entering. She didn't look back. Danielle Mercer's apartment was in Mapo-gu, 22 minutes from Hanam-dong by car, approximately 9 million tax brackets lower. It was a fifth-floor walk-up with a washing machine in the kitchen and a bathroom door that didn't quite close all the way unless you lifted the handle slightly and pulled left. Danielle had lived there for 4 years, running an American arts curatorial practice out of a desk, wedged between a bookshelf and the window, surrounded by print catalogs and coffee cups, and the organized disorder of a person who was extremely competent at her actual work and considered tidiness a separate discipline entirely outside her professional domain. She opened the door before Amara knocked. She'd seen the text from the car. She didn't say anything. She opened the door, took one look at Amara's face, and stepped aside. Amara came in. She set the suitcase against the wall. She sat down on Danielle's worn gray couch, and for a while she didn't cry. She just sat there with her hands in her lap and her coat still on, staring at the middle distance the way people do when the inside of their head is very loud and they're not ready to start explaining it in words yet. Danielle made tea. She didn't ask questions. She put a mug on the table in front of Amara and sat in the chair across from her and waited. After a while, Amara said, "The cup." "What?" She was using my cup. "The Osaka one." She paused. "He can get someone else. He can replace a secretary." But she knew which cup to use. "That means She stopped, pressed her lips together. "That means it's been going on long enough that she knew what cup I use in the morning." Danielle was quiet for a moment. "How long do you think?" Amara had been doing the math in the car, and she still wasn't sure the answer she'd arrived at was real. "The Tokyo trip started 8 months ago," she said. "I was going twice a month after March. The meetings always ran late. I usually stayed an extra night." She looked at her hands. "I made it very convenient. You didn't do anything wrong." "I know." And she did know that, intellectually, the way you know a fact you've read. Feeling it was different. "I just keep thinking about all the times I noticed something was off, and talked myself out of it." A look he gave her at that charity dinner last spring. He called her before he called me when the Busan deal closed. I thought I was being irrational. You were being gaslit. I was making excuses." She finally took off her coat. "Which isn't the same thing." Danielle didn't push back on the distinction. That was one of the things Amara had always valued about her. She didn't smooth things over. She let you arrive at the hard version of the truth, without trying to redirect you to something more comfortable. "What do you need tonight?" Danielle asked. "To not talk about him anymore tonight." "Done." They ordered food from the Jajangjian place 2 blocks over and watched a terrible television drama about a family fighting over a will, and Danielle laughed at the wrong moments, and Amara corrected her Korean reading of the subtitles 3 times. A sound beset temple, and somewhere in the middle of the second episode, Amara realized she'd stopped monitoring her phone for his calls. He had called 11 times. She turned the phone face down and didn't turn it back over. Seong-hwan stood in the center of the bedroom for a long time after he heard the car pull away. He'd spent 32 years building the specific version of himself that currently occupied this house, the one that other men approached with lowered voices and careful language, the one that rival organizations watched from a careful distance, the one that could redirect entire financial operations with a phone call, and whose silence at a negotiating table was considered more meaningful than most men's threats. He had constructed that version of himself deliberately, brick by brick, beginning at 22, when his father died and left him the shell of a shipping company and a list of debts that had made the attorneys pale, and he'd done it through ruthlessness and intelligence, and a particular brand of focused will that did not easily accommodate doubt. He was currently standing in his empty bedroom with his hands hanging at his sides, and he could not think of a single thing to do. He went downstairs eventually. Mrs. Cho had not moved from her position in the entrance hall. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who had served this family long enough that professional neutrality was costing her something genuine, and she was paying the cost without complaint. "Mrs. Cho," he said. "Yes, sir." He almost asked where Heyrin was. He caught himself. The question was obscene in the context, and some part of him, even now, knew it. "You can go home," he said. "Tell the staff the evening is done." "Yes, sir." He went to his study. The study was the one room in the house that reflected him, with compromised dark wood, no decorative items, a desk that had belonged to his grandfather, bookshelves that contained financial texts and maritime law references, and nothing purchased for aesthetic effect. He sat behind the desk and opened the laptop and looked at the screen for approximately 3 minutes without processing anything on it. Then his phone rang. J-Mock, his cousin, his intelligence chief. He answered. "Brother," J-Mock said, and something in the word's particular weight told Seong-hwan this was not a call about tonight, not about Amara, not about the wreckage of his personal life. J-Mock's voice had the flat, deliberate calm of a man carrying information he doesn't want to be carrying. "What is it? I need you in the office tonight. It's almost midnight. I know what time it is." A beat. Then the shipping schedules. "The ones from the Incheon run last February. I need to show you something about where they went." Seong-hwan's hand tightened around the phone. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said. The drive to his downtown office tower took Song through the eastern edge of Hanamdong, past the Han River, past the bridges lit orange and white against the dark water. He'd made this drive thousands of times. It had always felt like movement toward something, toward power, toward the empire he'd built floor by floor, decision by decision, alliance by alliance. Tonight the familiar route felt different, like he was being taken somewhere rather than going. J-Mock met him in the executive corridor on the 14th floor with a tablet and the expression of a man who had been awake for approximately 36 hours and was running on something colder than coffee. "Sit down," J-Mock said. Seong-hwan sat down. A sound like green wood splitting. He let his cousin lay the evidence out in its proper order, shipping schedules, cross-referenced against delivery logs, flagged against the financial transfers that shouldn't have been routed through the accounts they were routed through, the irregular communications patterns that J-Mock's team had traced back 6 months, and then 8 months, and then further. He let J-Mock finish. Then he said, "Hey, Rin," not a question. J-Mock nodded. "She had access to everything in your private office. The access codes, the encrypted scheduling system. We think she's been passing information for close to a year and a half. A year and a half. The math was not complicated. The relationship, whatever it had been, whatever name he was going to eventually assign to it once he was ready to look at it, directly had begun approximately 18 months ago. He could mark the date because he remembered the precise quality of his own loneliness at the time. Amara had been playing piano again, briefly, trying to reconnect with something she'd set down, and he'd been not just unsupportive, but actively impatient about it, suggesting the practice time was inconvenient, suggesting she was perhaps taking on too much given his schedule's demands, and she had closed the piano lid and not opened it again for 4 months, and he had registered this as a solved problem rather than a wound he'd inflicted. And into that wound, into the gap that his carelessness had created something, had found its way in. Do-Yun, J-Mock said, and pulled up a photograph. Baek Do-Yun, 34, Port Operations Director for the Eastern District. Smart, reliable, or so Seong-hwan had believed. He'd promoted Do-yoon twice. He's been negotiating with the Sohan group, Jae-mok said. Feeding them our territorial intelligence. The plan, as best we can reconstruct it, was to create enough instability in our port contracts to allow Sohan to move in during the chaos. Hae-rin provided the access. Do-yun provided the direction and the contact. Seong-hwan looked at the photograph. How close are they to moving? Close, maybe 3 weeks, maybe less. He sat with that for a moment. Outside the 14th floor windows, Seoul was indifferent, lit and gridded, and enormous, so operating on its own terms the way cities do, regardless of what individual men believe they control within them. You know what you're going to tell me, Seong-hwan said. That she used me. I'm going to give you the evidence, Jae-mok said carefully. What you do with the interpretation is, don't. Seong-hwan stood up. He walked to the window. Don't manage me, Jae-mok. Not tonight. His cousin was quiet. She did use me, Seong-hwan said. I'm not arguing that. But she didn't force me into the other decision. The one that wrecked my marriage. That was mine. He pressed 2 fingers against the glass. The city lights blurred slightly at the edges. I made my wife invisible for 9 years and told myself it was the natural order of our life. Nobody put that in my head. I grew it there. Jae-mok said nothing, which was, Seong-hwan thought, the correct response. Get me everything you have on Do-yun's communications with Seong-hwan, Seong-hwan said. I want the financial trail completely documented. We're not going to handle this the old way. I want this done through proper corporate and legal channels. He turned from the window. And nobody touches Amara. Nobody goes near her building. Nobody monitors her movements. Nobody makes the mistake of thinking that protecting her is part of my agenda here. She is not under my protection anymore. She is a private individual, and she stays that way. Are we clear? Clear, Jae-mok said. Seong-hwan picked up his jacket from the chair. One more thing, he said. Jae-mok waited. Get someone to remove Hae-rin's access to every system in this building by morning. Not suspended, removed, and her key card, and the parking access. I want it all gone before the building opens. He walked to the elevator without waiting for confirmation. In Mapo-gu, in Danielle Mercer's apartment, the television had been turned off, and Danielle had gone to bed. And Amara was lying on the fold-out couch in the living room, staring at the ceiling with the familiar blank wakefulness of someone whose mind has decided it has too much material to process for sleep to be a realistic option tonight. She thought about Seong-hwan. She thought about the person she had been when she met him 26 years old, in Seoul on a performance fellowship, playing at a mid-sized venue in Jongno that held perhaps 400 people on a good night, working on a composition that she believed, in her private arrogant heart, was the best thing she was capable of. She'd been playing piano since she was 5. She'd been serious about it since she was 12. She'd been competitive not in the showy way, but in the interior, grinding, never satisfied way of someone who knew exactly how much better she could be and found the gap between her current self and that better version intolerable in the most motivating possible way. She'd met Seong-hwan at a dinner hosted by the fellowship's organizational partner. He'd come in late and sat at the corner of the table, farthest from the center of attention, which was so unlike what she later learned about him that it had actually worked the one man in the room who didn't seem to be performing for anyone. He'd asked her, with what she now understood was characteristic directness, what the thing she was most working on was. Not what she played, not what her favorite piece was. What she was most working on. She'd told him about the composition. He'd asked to hear it sometime. She'd said yes before she'd finished the thought. That was the beginning, and the beginning had been real. She refused to give that up even now, lying on a fold-out couch in a cold apartment a decade later. The early years had contained something genuine. He'd been attentive in ways she hadn't expected from a man with his particular kind of power. He'd been curious about her work. He'd traveled to 2 of her performances in the first year they were together. And then the weight of what he was had slowly pressed down on everything they built, and she'd felt it happening, felt herself gradually compressing into a smaller and smaller version of herself, and this was the part she needed to be honest about. She had allowed it. Not without resistance, not without grief, but she had ultimately allowed it. Had set the composition aside, had let the piano lessons stop, had told herself month by month that the trade was reasonable, that this was what partnership with a complicated man required, that her ambitions were flexible, and his were not. She had been wrong about all of it, but especially about her ambitions being flexible. You could press something down for a long time. You could convince yourself it was gone. But it wasn't gone. It was just waiting for the moment when the weight was removed. She turned onto her side. At the far end of the living room, tucked against the wall beside a stack of exhibition catalogs, was an upright piano that she hadn't noticed when she arrived. Old, probably out of tune. The kind of instrument that ended up in apartments like this because someone years ago had gone through the significant effort of having it moved here, and then the piano had simply remained, as furniture tends to do, outlasting the intention that brought it. She looked at it in the dark, then she looked at the ceiling again. She didn't reach for her phone. She didn't think about Seong-hwan's 11 unanswered calls. She didn't think about tomorrow, or the recording that had been paused, or the conservatory work she'd told herself she'd get back to. Eventually, soon after some threshold that kept moving, she thought about the composition. The one she'd started at 26. The one she'd been working on the night she met Seong-hwan and told him about it across a dinner table in Jongno. A sound like green wood splitting, the one she'd packed carefully into her mental archives when she moved into his house and told herself she'd return to when things settled, and then things had never quite settled in the way that would have made returning feel safe. And the composition had sat there in the archive for 9 years, accumulating the particular weight of things you love that you have given no reason to believe you will ever come back to. She could feel it at the edges of her mind even now, not the specific notes, but the shape of it, the direction of it, the way she'd understood it when she was 26, as being about a certain kind of forward motion that didn't require arrival. She understood it differently now. She understood it as being about something she hadn't had language for yet at 26. Amara closed her eyes. She didn't sleep for a long time. But when she finally did, for the first time in many months, she did not wake up in the middle of the night listening for someone else's footsteps in the house. The piano was out of tune. Amara knew it. The moment she pressed the first key, what it was supposed to be, and what years of neglect had turned it into. The pitch wobbled at the edges, slightly flat, with the particular hollow quality of her strings that hadn't been touched in long enough that the wood around them had quietly rearranged its relationship to tension. She played it again anyway. It was 4:17 in the morning. Danielle's bedroom door was closed. The apartment was the specific kind of silent that only exists in cities between 3 and 5 when the late-night noise has finally collapsed and the early morning noise hasn't started yet. Amara had given up on sleep somewhere around 2, laying on the fold-out couch for another 90 minutes doing the particular arithmetic of a person whose mind refuses to stop working, and then finally sat up and looked at the piano in the dark and thought with the stripped-down clarity that sometimes arrives only when you're exhausted enough to stop arguing with yourself. I need to know if I can still do this. She sat down on the bench. It wobbled. A sound like green wood splitting. One leg was slightly shorter than the others, and the whole thing compensated by tilting 2 degrees to the left, a minor fault that would have irritated her on any other night, and tonight felt almost appropriate. She pressed the C again. Listened to the imperfect pitch settle into the air and dissolve. Then she started to play. Not the composition, not yet. Just scales first. Basic ascending patterns, right hand only, then left, then together. The foundational mechanical work that she'd done so by thousands of times between age 5 and age 25, that her hands had internalized the muscle memory so completely it didn't require thought. What she was checking for was not whether she remembered the patterns. She was checking whether her hands still knew how to be her hands at a piano, a fountain, whether the 9 years of domestic life had done something irreversible to the particular relationship between her fingers and the instrument that had defined her before Seong-hwan, before soul, before all of it. The first few minutes were rough. Her fourth finger on the left hand, always the weakest, the one that required the most deliberate cultivation, was stiff and reluctant, the joints not quite moving at the speed she was asking them to. She made mistakes, in places she hadn't made mistakes since she was 17. She hit wrong intervals in the 4th octave transition. She lost the evenness of touch in the right hand's middle register that she'd spent 3 years, she's 20s, learning to maintain. She kept going. Somewhere around the 15-minute mark, something shifted. Not dramatically. Not like a door swinging open. More like a door that had been stuck, yielding a few degrees, the pressure becoming movement, becoming incremental possibility. Her left hand found its timing. The fourth finger loosened. The touch evened out. She moved from scales into something else, without consciously deciding to a fragment she'd been working on at 26. From the composition, the opening phrase that had always felt to her like the piece's emotional center of gravity, the thing the rest of it orbited around. 8 bars. She played them slowly below tempo, feeling for the shape. They were still there, all of it, exactly where she'd left it. She sat for a long moment with her hands resting on the keys, and her eyes closed and the imperfect piano humming slightly from what she'd just played, and she felt not happy, not resolved, not anything as clean as either of those, but something close to located. Like she'd been in an unfamiliar building for a very long time and had finally found a window she recognized. She played for another hour. When Danielle appeared in the living room doorway at 5:45 in a gray sweatshirt, with her hair flattened on one side and a look of mild bewilderment on her face, Amara stopped mid-phrase. "How long have you been up?" Danielle said. "A while." Danielle looked at the piano, then at Amara. "Is it even in tune?" "No." "Are you okay?" Amara thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet, but I think I need to find Celeste." Celeste Rowan ran the Seoul International Performing Arts Conservatory out of a converted building in Seo-daemun-gu that smelled of floor wax and rosin and the specific institutional coffee that performing arts organizations worldwide appeared to brew from the same ancient suffering machine. She was 57 years old, British Ghanaian, and possessed of the particular brand of sharp-edged warmth that characterized people who had spent decades managing creative talent, people who could deliver devastating criticism and genuine encouragement. In the same breath, without either one feeling false. She'd hired Amara to teach introductory piano 3 years before. Amara had left the position after 6 months because Seong-hwan's schedule had made the commute logistically complicated, which was a reason that had felt practical at the time, and now felt like a euphemism. She'd told herself so many times it had started to sound like truth. Celeste opened her office door, looked at Amara, standing in the hallway with the expression of someone who had been half expecting this visit for approximately 3 years. "Come in," she said. Closed the door. Amara came in and sat. She didn't perform wellness. She didn't construct a professional version of the situation. She looked at Celeste across the desk and said, "I left my husband. I have 1 suitcase, and I'm sleeping on a fold-out couch in Mapo-gu. I need to work." Celeste folded her hands on the desk. "What kind of work?" "Teaching. If you still have the position." "I have 3 positions. I've been having trouble filling them because the pay is honest and rather impressive." She studied Amara for a moment, with assessing attention of someone who makes her living reading performance under pressure. "Are you performing again, or just teaching?" "Teaching for now." That's a partial answer. It's the honest part of the answer. Celeste was quiet for a moment. Outside the office, somewhere in the building's corridor, a cello was playing something slow and slightly too careful a student working through a passage they hadn't fully internalized yet. The playing of someone who was thinking about the notes rather than through them. "You have an open classroom, Tuesdays and Thursdays," Celeste said. 4 students at intermediate level, 2 at advanced. The advanced pair will challenge you." She paused. "They'll also notice if you're not fully present, so don't come in here still in pieces." "I'm not in pieces," Celeste raised an eyebrow. "I'm angry," Amara clarified. "Pieces feel scattered. Anger is focused. That I can work with." Celeste picked up her pen. "Start Tuesday." Seong-hwan's morning meeting was at 8. He'd been in the building since 6:15, which was unusual enough that his assistant, a methodical 30-year-old named Park Sung-jin, who managed Seong-hwan's schedule with the precision of someone who understood that the chairman's time was the organizational axis, everything else revolved around, had sent a tentative inquiry at 6:22 asking if additional preparation was needed for the day. Seong-hwan had not replied. He sat at his desk with Jae-mok's tablet in front of him, working through the financial documentation for the third time. Not because he'd missed anything. Jae-mok's work was meticulous, but because he was a man who made major decisions slowly and then executed them without hesitation, and he was currently in the slow part, turning the evidence over in his mind. The way you turn something fragile, checking every angle before you commit to the pressure. Baek Do-yoon's conspiracy was the professional problem. The professional problem he knew how to handle. It was the other thing that kept pulling at the edge of his attention, the thing he kept trying to set aside and deal with later, with more composure, when he wasn't already running on 3 hours of sleep and the specific hollowness that follows the kind of night that doesn't resolve cleanly into morning. He called his mother at 7:15. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake, which meant she'd heard something from someone, which was not surprising because Kwon Mi-suk had constructed and maintained a network of familial intelligence over 68 years of life that rivaled anything her son had built professionally. "I was wondering when you'd call," she said. "I assume you know. Mrs. Cho called her sister last night. Her sister is friends with my housekeeper. So yes, a pause, I know enough. Then you know Amara has left. I know she was given a very specific kind of reason to leave." Seong-hwan leaned back, and he could feel the conversation orienting itself in the way his mother's conversations always did, not toward where he wanted to go, but toward where she'd already determined the truth was, and he could either walk toward it or walk around it, but the destination didn't change. "Mother, how long?" she said. Not a question. The flat, declarative inflection of a woman who had already assembled the timeline and was asking him to confirm it rather than construct it. "Several months," he said. "And Amara. She found out last night." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that he could hear his mother's kitchen in the background, the faint sound of water, a cabinet closing, the ordinary domestic mechanics of a morning that was continuing on its own terms, regardless of the conversation happening inside it. "You know what I think of the secretary," his mother said. "I can guess. I'm not interested in her. She's not the problem." Another pause. "You told yourself a story about your marriage, Seong-hwan. You told yourself that what Amara needed was what you were providing: the house, the security, the name. You decided that for her. You made that calculation on her behalf, and then you were surprised when the life you'd arranged for her didn't make her happy. I'm aware of my mistakes. You're aware that you made mistakes. That's different from being aware of what they were." Her voice didn't sharpen. It was worse than that. It was even unclear the way his mother's voice got when she was saying something she'd been holding for a long time. "I watched that woman sit at your dinner table for 9 years and manage your guests and remember details about your business partners' families and shrink herself down to a size that fit inside the life you were living. And I watched you accept that shrinking as though it was the natural shape of her. That's not..." He stopped. "Is it wrong?" He didn't answer. "The secretary didn't ruin your marriage," Mi-suk said. "Your marriage had been eroding for years because you were pouring everything you had into an empire and offering your wife the leftovers and calling it partnership." A brief silence. "Now, what are you going to do about it?" "Right now, I'm going to deal with Do-yun." "I mean about Amara." "I don't know yet." "That's the first honest thing you've said this morning," his mother said and hung up. Do-yun arrived at the 8 o'clock meeting with the relaxed confidence of a man who believes his tracks are covered. That was the first thing Seong-hwan noted, the quality of Do-yun's composure. It was too comfortable. A man who had nothing to hide would have come in with the baseline professional alertness that most of Seong-hwan's senior people maintained, the low-grade performance of competence and preparedness. Do-yun came in loose, unhurried, with his jacket unbuttoned and a coffee cup in his hand, which was a small thing but not a neutral thing. It was the composure of someone who has a contingency plan and trusts it. Seong-hwan had asked Jae-mok and 2 senior legal advisors to be present. No one else. Do-yun registered the configuration of the room when he entered, and something shifted behind his eyes. Not panic. Not yet, just recalibration. He looked at the legal advisors. He looked at Jae-mok, whose face communicated nothing. He looked at Seong-hwan. "Sit down," Seong-hwan said. Do-yun sat. Seong-hwan pushed the tablet across the table. Du-yun looked at the first document, and his coffee cup stopped moving halfway to his mouth. The Incheon shipping schedule from February, Seong-hwan said. The one that was accessed from my private system on a Tuesday evening when I was in Busan. You were in the building. Haerin was in the building. He let that sit for a moment. The communication record from the routing that followed matches a server weave, traced to a company registered in Guangzhou that has no visible connection to this organization. The company's financial records show 3 transfers totaling approximately 40 million won over the past 14 months. The recipient accounts have been traced. Du-yun set the coffee cup down. Very carefully. I'd like to speak with my attorney, he said. You can do that, Seong-hwan said, after we finish. I'm not arresting you, Do-yun. I'm not going to have you driven somewhere and ask questions in a room with no cameras. That's not how this is going to work. He leaned forward slightly. What's going to work is that everything on that tablet goes to the Financial Crimes Prosecutor's office this afternoon. Everything. The transfers, the communications, the access logs, the Sohan connection. All of it goes through the legal system, and I let the legal system handle it. Du-yun's jaw moved, but no words came out. What that means for you specifically, Seong-hwan continued, is that your attorney needs to be very good and very fast, because the documentation is complete, and I've been told it's sufficient for charges. He sat back. You chose to steal from this organization. You chose to try to dismantle what I built. You made that decision, and you'll live inside its consequences. But you'll do it through the courts, not through me. He glanced at Jae-mok. Escort him out. Du-yun stood up. Something had drained out of him over the past 4 minutes, not just the confidence, but something behind it, the structural thing the confidence had been resting on. He looked older suddenly. He looked like someone who had spent a long time building a move and had just it dissolve. You're making a mistake, Du-yun said at the door. Going through official channels. You know what exposure that creates. For you, Seong-hwan said yes, I'm aware. Du-yun left. Jae-mok closed the door and looked at his cousin. The legal advisors were already gathering their documents. The room had the particular residual tension of a confrontation that has concluded without violence, which in their world carried its own specific weight. The Sohan people will know by this afternoon, Jae-mok said. Let them. If they think we're using official channels, they'll worry about their own exposure. That's the point. Seong-hwan gathered the tablet. I want them worried. I want every piece of this visible to the people who can prosecute it. I'm done conducting business in rooms where the only accountability is the one I impose. Jae-mok was quiet for a moment. He'd known Seong-hwan for 34 years, and he'd watched him conduct the organization with methods that were efficient and effective and never anywhere near a courtroom, and he understood what this represented. This is going to change things, Jae-mok said. I know. Not just with Do-yun. With everything. The people who've been operating under the assumption that certain kinds of problems get handled a certain kind of way. Seong-hwan stood up. Start drafting new operational protocols. I want Betrayal's exposure on the criminal side mapped and a restructuring timeline prepared. We're not doing this overnight, and we're not doing it carelessly, but we're doing it. He picked up his jacket. And get me Hae-rin's formal termination documents by noon. Clean severance. No negotiation, no contact from this office again. He walked out. The conservatory's practice rooms were small and impractical and distributed across 3 floors in an order that suggested the building's original architect had been making decisions under unusual constraints. Amara's assigned classroom was on the 2nd floor, room 2C, with 2 windows that overlooked the building's narrow interior courtyard and a Yamaha upright that was, compared to Danielle's apartment piano, an instrument of considerable dignity. Her Tuesday class arrived in pieces. The intermediate students came in the way. Intermediate students always came slightly late, carrying too much, with a particular combination of capability and unfinished discipline that made this the most complicated level to teach well. 2 of them were teenagers, Korean, siblings whose parents had enrolled them together. A sound like green wood splitting, they were both competitive with each other and occasionally communicative in the wordless rapid-fire shorthand of siblings who had been fighting the same battles for years. The other two intermediates were adults, a woman in her late 30s who worked in finance and played with impressive technical precision and almost no feeling, and a quiet man around 40 who played with considerable feeling and deeply approximate technique. The advanced students arrived together and exactly on time, which Amara clocked immediately as a data point. On time to the second, both of them, entering in a way that suggested this was a coordinated habit. They were young mid-20s, both women, one named Kim Soo-yeon and one named Park Ji-na, and they had the quality that genuinely advanced students sometimes had, a kind of alert stillness, like musicians who are always partially listening to something other people can't hear. Soo-yeon looked at Amara with the direct, unapologetic attention of someone taking a measurement. "We heard you used to perform," she said, not aggressive. Informational, like she was clarifying a data point she'd encountered and wanted to verify. "I did," Amara said. "Why did you stop?" The adult finance woman looked mortified. The siblings exchanged a look. "Because I made a bad trade," Amara said. "And then I stopped making it." She set her teaching notes on the piano. "Shall we begin?" The days assembled themselves into a pattern that Amara found, to her own mild surprise, stabilizing rather than merely functional. Mornings at Danielle's apartment coffee, the fold-out couch converted back to its daytime configuration, the practiced smallness of fitting her life into a borrowed space. Tuesday and Thursday at the conservatory. The other days in the conservatory's practice rooms, which Celeste let her use during off hours. A sound like green, where she worked on the composition in the late afternoons when the building was mostly empty, and the acoustics of the practice rooms were the only company she had. The composition was coming back in pieces. Not all at once. Not smoothly, it was more like excavation than composition, digging down through years of accumulated silt to find the structure she'd buried. And some of what she found was still intact, and some of it needed to be rebuilt from a different understanding than the one she'd had at 26. She was not the same musician. The music she was excavating was the same music, but she was bringing different hands to it. She did not check Seong-hwan's calls. There were 17 of them by the end of the first week, and then they stopped, which landed differently than she'd expected, not as relief exactly. More like the particular absence that follows a persistent sound when it finally goes quiet, the way you don't notice the noise of a refrigerator until it stops running, and the room feels different without being able to immediately name why. What she did not anticipate was Do-yeon. The name arrived through Danielle, who had a friend who worked at a financial industry publication who had heard through the particular accelerated gossip circuit of Seoul's business community that Kwon Maritime Holdings had Kwon Maritime documentation with the Financial Crimes Prosecutor's Office, citing internal fraud and corporate espionage, that the named party was a former director of port operations, and that the investigation had links to a rival logistics cult organization called Seong-hwan. Danielle set her phone on the kitchen table between them, with the news pulled up. Amara read it twice. "He went through official channels," Danielle said. "I know what official channels means. For him specifically, I mean. That's not—" Danielle stopped, organizing her words. "That's not what he does. What he's always done." Amara pushed the phone back toward Danielle. "This has nothing to do with me. I'm not saying it does. I'm saying it's notable. He can make 100 notable decisions, and none of them change what he did or what I need to do." She picked up her coffee cup. "He has an organization to protect. He's protecting it. That's who he's always been. This doesn't mean anything new about him." But she thought about it later, alone in practice room 2C, with the composition open on the music stand, her hands resting on the keys without playing. She thought about what she knew of Seong-hwan, the specific, unflattering truth of him, the version she'd spent 9 years living alongside, rather than the version he presented to the city. He was not a man who invited external scrutiny. He was not a man who handed his problems to external authorities. He was a man who solved things internally in the dark, with methods that didn't create public records. Going through the prosecutor's office was not nothing. A sound like greenwood splitting. She pressed her hands down into the keyboard and let the chord spread through the room without releasing it, holding the sustain pedal until the sound had nearly disappeared, and then she started playing again. Jae-mok brought the next piece of bad news himself in person, which told Seong-hwan, before a single word was spoken, that the next piece of bad news was significant. The Sohan contact, Jae-mok said. He sat down across from Seong-hwan's desk with the careful body language of someone who is not certain how information will land. We've been running the communications, traced the full documentation from Do-yoon's records. The primary contact at Sohan. He set a photograph on the desk. You know him. Seong-hwan looked at the photograph. He kept his face neutral. It required effort. Baek Sungul, he said. Do-yoon's older brother, Jae-mok, let that sit. He's been with Sohan for 6 years. Senior position. We didn't have him on our radar because there was no obvious family connection. Do-yoon's brother took his mother's name after the parents' divorce, so the surname didn't flag. Seong-sin set the photograph down. Do-yoon didn't just go looking for an outside partner, he said. He went to his own family. The surveillance record goes back further than we initially thought. The first contact between Do-yoon and Sung-il on our networks was 2 years ago, before Hae-rin had access to the scheduling systems. Son was very still. He recruited her, he said. We believe so, yes. Jae-mok's voice stayed flat and professional. We believe the relationship between Hae-rin and Do-yoon preceded her employment in your office. We think her position there was the objective, not the coincidence. The room was very quiet. Seong-hwan had already known on some level that Hae-rin had used him. He'd said as much to Jae-mok the night the evidence first appeared. But knowing and understanding are layered things, and the layer he now had to sit inside was this. He had been specifically chosen, not stumbled upon, not opportunistically exploited. He had been identified as a target. His particular combination of power and vanity and marital unhappiness had been assessed from the outside and judged exploitable. And then, a human being had been inserted into his life with the calculated intention of using his own weaknesses against him. He had made it easy. He had made it so extraordinarily easy. There's something else, Jae-mok said. Seong-hwan looked at him. She kept recordings. Jae-mok's voice dropped a register. From your office. Not just document files, audio recordings. Our forensics team found the files on the device she used. Most of it is operational schedules, financial discussions, territorial decisions. But some of it is personal. He paused. Conversations between the two of you. In your office. In the residence. Seong-hwan felt something go cold in his chest. How much? He said. Enough. If she or whoever she was working for chose to surface it, the operational create criminal exposure. Not just for Baekryong, for you personally. The room resettled itself around this information. Seong-hwan could feel the architecture of his situation. Rearranging, could feel the particular vertigo of a man who had believed himself to be the one holding leverage, discovering that someone else had been holding a counterweight the entire time. That the balance he'd relied on had been an illusion. Where is Hae-rin now, he said. It came out quiet. Left the country 3 days ago. Osaka, then connecting flight. We lost her after Osaka. Do-yoon's brother. In custody as of this morning. The prosecutor's office moved fast. Jae-mok looked at his cousin carefully. The recordings complicate things, Seong-hwan. If she surfaces them. She won't surface them yet, Seong-hwan said. If she wanted to use them for immediate damage, she'd have done it before she ran. She's holding them. He thought through the mechanics with the part of his mind that had never stopped being operational even now. Insurance. She's keeping them in case we come after her. So she's gone, but she still has a hand on the wheel. For now, he stood up. He walked to the window. Seoul was doing what Seoul did, enormous, indifferent, lit and loud, and operating on its own massive momentum regardless of what any individual man believed he controlled within it. We find out where she went. Quietly. Through legitimate means, only I want no one doing anything that creates additional exposure. And then we wait for her to make a mistake. He turned from the window. She will. She's been running a long game on borrowed patience, and the support system she was relying on is collapsing. Without Do-yoon, without Sunul, she's operating independently with material. She can't easily monetize without surfacing herself. He looked at Jae-mok directly. Set up a discrete monitoring protocol, and update our legal team about the recordings. I want them to know the exposure. before it comes from any other direction. Jae-mok nodded. He gathered his materials. At the door, he stopped. Amara doesn't know about any of this, he said. The recordings don't include her. She was never part of I know, Seong-hwan said. I just thought, she's not coming back, because I cleaned up my own mess, Seong-hwan said. And she's not going to be used as a reason to manage the situation differently than I'd manage it otherwise. Leave her out of this completely. Jae-mok left. Seong-hwan stood at his desk and picked up his phone and looked at Amara's contact entry for a long moment. He put the phone down without calling. The recording happened on a Thursday evening, in late October, in the third week of Amara's return to the conservatory. She'd stayed past 8, working on the composition, alone in practice room 2C, pushing through a transitional passage in the third movement that had been resisting her for days, not technically difficult, but emotionally evasive, requiring something she hadn't yet located, a quality of letting go at a specific moment in the phrase that she understood intellectually and couldn't yet embody in the playing. She'd been at it for nearly 2 hours, approaching the same passage from different angles, trying different tempos, different touch, different intentions. Then, at some point past 8:30, she stopped trying to fix it. She played the piece from the beginning instead, not for the passage, not to work on anything, just to play it, the whole thing all the way through for the first time since she'd been back, to see what it had become. She didn't know the conservatory employee was in the building. She didn't know he'd paused in the corridor outside her practice room. She didn't know he had his phone out, because the sound coming through the door had stopped him, mid-steep, and something about it had made him reach into his pocket without fully deciding to. She played for 40 minutes. The employee, 22 years old, part-time facilities staff, with a modest personal social media account he used mainly to post about food and film, recorded the final 90 seconds through the practice room door. Not the whole thing, just the ending, the final movement, the place where the composition arrived at something she hadn't known it was going to arrive at when she was 26, where the forward motion that had always defined the piece's character suddenly opened into something wide and still and earned. He posted it at 10:12 that night, with a simple caption, "Don't know who this is, but I work in a music school, and I just stood in the hallway and couldn't move for 40 minutes. By Thursday midnight, it had 40,000 views. By Friday morning, 300,000. By Friday evening, Celeste Rowan was calling Amara's phone every 20 minutes, and a producer named Marcus Webs, based in London, had sent a formal inquiry through the conservatory's administrative contact, requesting an introduction to the unnamed pianist. A sound like green wood splitting, and someone had identified the practice room's distinctive courtyard-facing windows in the background of the clip, and tracked it to the conservatory's building address. And the story black pianist discovered in Seoul Music School was circulating in the particular fast, emotionally driven way that stories circulate when they contain something people feel rather than just consume. Amara sat on Danielle's couch on Friday evening with her phone showing her numbers she had no framework for, and Danielle was next to her eating takeout and occasionally refreshing the video and announcing updated view counts with the stunned enthusiasm of someone watching a phenomenon happen in real time. And Amara said nothing for a very long time. Then she said, "I need a better piano." Danielle looked at her. "I mean it," Amara said. "I can't record anything serious on what I've been using. I need to call Celeste about using the performance hall after hours." She was already standing. She looked at her phone, at the notification count, at the producer's name she didn't recognize yet. "And I need to listen to that recording." She pressed play on the video. She heard herself play the final passage, the way it sounded through a phone camera, pressed against a practice room door, the quality slightly compressed, the edges slightly soft and still, unmistakably itself. A sound like green, still the thing she'd been building toward for 20 years, the piece that had waited inside her through 9 years of a life that had no room for it. She watched the view counter add another 800 in the 30 seconds she'd been watching. Her hands were shaking. She put the phone face down on the table and pressed both palms flat against it, feeling the surface cool beneath them, and she thought about Seong-hwan with a clarity that she wasn't expecting, not with grief, not with anger, but with something almost like distance, like she could see the shape of the last 9 years from a position outside them for the first time. He had always told her, never in direct words but in accumulation, that exactly this, whatever was currently happening on the other side of her pressed-down phone was smaller than the things that mattered. That his empire and his meetings and his territorial negotiations were the real weight, and she was the pleasant addendum. 300,000 people had stood in a hallway and couldn't move. She picked the phone back up, and when Marcus Webb's name appeared on her screen 6 seconds later with a London area code attached, Amara looked at it for exactly 1 ring before she answered. Marcus Webb had a voice like someone who had spent decades in rooms where money changed hands and had learned to make that sound like culture. He was 51, London-based, with a production company that had launched 4 in the past 8 years that Amara had heard of and probably 3 more she hadn't. A soundson. He spoke with the particular measured enthusiasm of someone who had been genuinely excited by things in the industry before and had learned to filter that excitement through professional calibration so that it didn't look like desperation. But the calibration wasn't quite hiding it tonight, which told Amara something useful about what he thought he was looking at. The clip has 460,000 views as of 40 minutes ago, he said. That's not a viral moment. That's an audience telling you something. It's 90 seconds recorded through a door, Amara said. On a phone. I know what it is. I've been in this business long enough to know that the quality of the recording is completely irrelevant to what it's communicating. What it's communicating is that you made a hallway full of strangers stop moving. A brief pause. When can you be in London? She almost laughed. I'm in the middle of something. I understand. I'm not asking you to pack tonight. I'm asking when you can come have a conversation about what comes next, because something is coming next whether we have that conversation or not. And I'd rather you have someone in your corner who knows how to shape it. He paused again, shorter this time. I've been doing this for 26 years, Ms. Winslow. I've seen 100 people go viral, and I've watched 90 of them disappear within 6 months because they didn't have a framework for what was happening to them. You have something that doesn't disappear. I'd like to help you not disappear. She stood at Danielle's kitchen counter, with the phone against her ear, and her free hand pressed flat on the tile, and she thought with the particular stripped-down clarity that had been arriving in her more frequently since the night she left. Seong-hwan, that this was the conversation she would have had at 26 if she hadn't made the trade she made. That this was the door that had been standing somewhere in her future for 20 years, and she was now standing in front of it. And the only question was whether she was going to open it or find another reason to walk past it. 2 weeks, she said. I need 2 weeks to get some things in order here. Then I can come to London. 2 weeks, Marcus said. I'll have my assistant send you the dates. Another pause, warmer this time, less calculated. Ms. Winslow, for what it's worth the way you play that passage at the end. The place where the piece opens up. I've been in this industry for a very long time, and I can count on one hand the number of times I've heard something and thought that person has been waiting to say this for years. Amara was quiet for a moment. 20 years, she said. Give or take. She ended the call. Danielle was watching, her from the doorway with her takeout container in one hand, and the expression of someone who has been watching a scene develop that they suspected was coming, but didn't want to predict too specifically in case they were wrong. Well, Danielle said, London. 2 weeks. Danielle set down the container and crossed the room and wrapped both arms around Amara from behind with the wordless forcefulness of a best friend who understands that this moment is too large for a response that depends primarily on language. Amara stood inside the hug for a moment and then said, I need to practice. Of course you do, Danielle said. The video hit 2 million views by Sunday morning. Celeste Rowan called at 7:45, before the conservatory opened, which was a significant signal in itself because Celeste was a woman whose relationship with mornings was strategic rather than warm. I assume you've seen the numbers, Celeste said. I've been watching them go up for 3 days. I've had 6 media inquiries, 2 from Korean outlets, 1 from a British arts magazine, 1 from an American classical music publication I respect, and 2 from places I don't respect at all, but that have large audiences. A brief pause. I also had a call this morning from the Seoul Arts Council about a featured performance slot in their spring program. I sat up on the fold-out couch. The morning light coming through Danielle's living room window was thin and gray, the specific light of Seoul in late October. What kind of slot? A full recital, 2 hours. The main performance hall in the Sejong Center. They want a named performer, not a conservatory showcase. Celeste's voice had the careful quality of someone delivering information that is significant enough to require precision. They're offering a performance fee, a real one. And they want the composition. The composition. The piece that had started all of this, that had been locked inside her for 9 years, that she hadn't fully finished, that she was still excavating. When is the slot? Amara said, March, which gives you approximately 4 months. Amara looked at her hands in her lap. The calluses on her fingertips were coming back. Slowly, the skin rebuilding itself the way it does when you return to an instrument after a long absence, the body remembering a previous version of itself and gradually reinstating it. Yes, she said. You haven't heard the fee. It doesn't matter. Yes. Celeste was quiet for a moment. Good, she said, and the word was brief enough and direct enough that it carried the weight of something she meant deeply. Use the performance hall for practice. Full access whenever it isn't booked. I'll have the schedule sent to you. Seong-hwan saw the clip for the first time on Monday morning. His assistant Sung-jin had flagged it in the morning briefing document with a single line, viral video, approximately 2.1 million views, subject identified as Lee M. as Ms. Amara Winslow. Sung-jin was thorough and careful with language, and the phrase identified as told Seong-hwan that Sung-jin had understood something about the sensitivity of the notation and had chosen neutral ground. He watched it once, then he watched it again. The recording quality was, as Amara had told Marcus Webb, a phone pressed against a practice room door. The camera barely moved. The sound was slightly compressed at the lower registers, and the upper frequencies had the particular distortion of a phone microphone pushed beyond its comfortable range. None of that mattered. What came through the recording, despite all of it, what apparently came through clearly, enough that 2.1 million people had stopped to listen, was the thing Seong-hwan had never properly heard in. 9 years of living beside the person playing it. He watched it a third time. He watched the view counter accumulate in real time at the bottom of the screen. He watched the comments load and refresh. He did not read the comments, but he watched the number of them grow the particular anonymous mass enthusiasm of a global audience that had found something it recognized. He closed the laptop. He sat at his desk in the quiet of the early morning building. It was 6:45. The staff wouldn't arrive for another hour, and he sat with the specific quality of feeling that arrives when you understand something you should have understood years ago, and the understanding is completely useless to you now in any practical sense except as evidence of your own failure of attention. She had been playing piano in his house. The first year of their marriage, she'd played in the evenings sometimes, in the second reception room where they'd put an instrument he'd bought without asking what she preferred. And he'd come home to the sound of it, and he'd found it pleasant, the way you find background music pleasant, which was to say he'd heard it without listening. Which was to say he had heard evidence of this every single week for the first year of their life together and had processed, in fact, as at the level of ambient texture rather than meaning. He had not deserved the 9 years. He was not sure what he deserved now, but he was certain it was not the 9 years she'd given him. He opened his desk drawer. He took out the notepad he used for handwritten notes, real paper, not digital. Splitting. One of the few habitual old-fashionedness he'd maintained, because something about it made him think more carefully than he thought on a screen, and he held the pen over the paper for a long time without writing anything. Then he wrote her name. Just her name. Nothing else. He looked at it. He put the pen down without writing anything further, because the thing he wanted to say was not ready yet, was not honest enough yet. A sound like green wood splitting had not passed through enough genuine reckoning to be worth the paper it would require, and the one thing he absolutely would not do was write her something that was less than what she deserved to hear. He put the notepad in his desk and went back to work. The Sejong Center's main performance hall had a Steinway Model D concert grand, that Amara loved the way you love instruments that are significantly better than anything you've had reliable access to, with a mixture of gratitude and something almost like caution, the careful reverence of a person who doesn't want to take for granted the thing they've been given back. She started using the hall at 6 in the mornings, 3 hours before it was scheduled for anything else, because the mornings were when her concentration was sharpest, and the building was quiet enough that she could hear the full acoustic range of the instrument without the building's daytime noise blurring the edges. The composition was close. She could feel its shape the way you can feel the shape of something in the dark, not see it, not hold it fully yet, but sense the dimensions of it, know approximately where the edges were. The third movement's transitional passage that resisted her for weeks in the practice room was finally opening, the quality of release she'd been searching for, arriving in fragments and then in longer stretches, and then, on a Thursday morning in early November, for the first time completely and continuously for the full duration of the passage. She stopped playing when it ended. She sat at the Steinway in the empty performance hall, and the sound of what she'd just played settled into the air around her and dissolved gradually into silence. And she sat inside the silence for a long moment, feeling the rightness of it, not perfection, not arrival, but genuine earned rightness, the sense of a thing being what it is supposed to be. She was close. She took out her phone to check the time. She had 7 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize. Same number. 7 calls in 40 minutes, beginning at 6:12 and ending at 6:51. No voicemails. She stared at the number. Then, because something about the pattern, the volume, the interval between calls, the absence of any voicemail felt like urgency rather than spam, she called it back. It answered on the first ring. Ms. Winslow, a woman's voice. Controlled, professional, with a specific precision of diction that suggested someone accustomed to making their meaning completely clear in high-stakes environments. My name is Shin Ji-young. I'm an investigative journalist with the Korea Financial Transparency Project. I've been trying to reach you for the past week. Amara's hand tightened slightly on the phone. I don't give interviews right now. This isn't about the music. A brief pause. Ms. Winslow, I'm going to ask you directly, because I think you deserve directness. Are you aware that your name appears in documents filed with the Financial Crimes Prosecutor's Office related to the Kwon Maritime Holdings internal fraud investigation? The Steinway's last chord was still fading in the air. What? Amara said. Your name, your U.S. Social Security number, and documentation suggesting a joint ownership stake in 3 offshore holding companies that were used to move funds connected to the Betrayal organization's port operations. The documentation was filed as part of evidence submitted by Kwon Maritime's legal team. Shin's voice remained even and professional. The prosecutor's office opened a supplementary inquiry. Preliminary stage, but your name is in the file, Ms. Winslow. Amara stood up from the piano bench. Her legs carried her 3 steps away from the instrument before she registered that she'd moved. That's impossible. I have no connection to any of his organizations. I never had any involvement with the business side. The documents suggest otherwise. They show your signature on incorporation filings for the 3 companies, dated between 4 and 6 years ago. Those signatures are not mine. I believe you, Shin said, and the directness of it was startling, not what Amara had expected. That's why I'm calling you before the story runs. Because I don't think you know about this, and because I think someone used your identity to create documentation that can now be used against you. A pause. Ms. Winslow, I've been investigating Baekryong's financial operations for 14 months. The offshore companies in question, the ones with your name, were set up as insulation layers. They were designed to look like legitimate partnerships. If they're used as evidence, they implicate you in financial crimes, regardless of whether you signed anything. Amara's back hit the wall of the performance hall. She didn't notice. She was processing the information the way you process something that is fundamentally incompatible with your understanding of reality by going over it twice, 3 times, looking the parts where it stops making sense, and finding instead that it continues to take sense in a direction you don't want it to go. Who set up the companies? She said. We believe Do-yoon and Hae-rin operating through a third party. Shin paused. Here is what I need you to understand. The documents were submitted to the prosecutor's office by Kwan Maritime's own legal team as part of the internal fraud case against Do Yun. We don't know if they submitted them intentionally to implicate you, or if they submitted them as part of a complete evidence package without fully understanding what was in it. But either way, my name is in a criminal file, Amara said. Yes. She pressed the back of her head against the wall and looked at the ceiling of the performance hall, the high-vaulted ceiling, the acoustic panels, the rigging overhead. The Steinway was 15 feet away. Her composition was in her bag. London was in 2 weeks. The spring concert was in 4 months. Ms. Winslow, Shin said, I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. Do you have any documentation, any at all, that establishes your separation from Kwan Maritime's financial operations? Anything that would establish you had no access to or knowledge of the offshore accounts? Amara thought. A sound like creaking, splitting. Going back through 9 years of managed domestic existence, through all the moments when she had been the wife at the dinner party and not the person in the room who understood what the dinner party was actually about. No, she said, I was never involved, which means I never made documentation proving I wasn't involved. That's the problem, Shin said quietly. She called Danielle first. Then she sat on the steps outside the Sejong Center in the cold morning air and didn't call Seong-hwan. Because calling Seong-hwan was the instinct, and the instinct was wrong. Wrong because she'd spent 9 years defaulting to his power to solve problems, and she would not do it now, not when his world was the source of the problem, not when trusting his framework was the thing that had stripped her of any independent record of her own existence within their marriage. She needed a lawyer. She needed a Korean lawyer who worked in financial crimes and had no connection to Kwan Maritime Holdings or anything adjacent to it. She called Celeste. Not because Celeste was a lawyer, but because Celeste had been operating in Seoul's institutional and professional landscape for 20 years and knew people who knew the right people. And right now, Amara needed to be pointed in the correct direction before she moved in any direction at all. Celeste asked 3 precise questions and said, "Give me an hour," and hung up. Amara sat on the steps. A city maintenance worker passed below her on the plaza with a leaf blower, and the sound of it was enormous and mundane and completely indifferent to the situation, which was somehow both irritating and steadying. The city didn't care. The city was going to continue being the city, regardless of what was happening in the prosecutor's office, or in the offshore accounts, or in the 9-year marriage that had apparently left her name attached to financial instruments she'd never touched. Her phone rang, Seong-hwan. She looked at it. It rang 4 times. 5 stopped. A text arrived. I need to speak with you. Please. It's about the legal documents. I know you've already heard. I need to explain. She read it twice. She put her phone in her pocket. She did not call back. Jae-mok was standing at Seong-hwan's office door when Seong-hwan got off the phone with his attorney, and the expression on his face was the one he wore when he was containing something that was pressing hard against the container. You know she's been contacted, Jae-mok said. A journalist. Shin Ji-young, Korea Financial Transparency Project. Seong-hwan moved past him into the office. How long has she been running the Betrayal investigation? 14 months. We had awareness of her generally but not specific focus on the offshore structures. Jae-mok came inside and closed the door. The legal team submitted the complete evidence package to the prosecutor. Complete, unredacted. The attorneys flagged the offshore company documentation as relevant to Do-yoon's financial manipulation, which it was, but they didn't fully trace every named party on the incorporation documents before submitting. Seong-hwan sat down. He placed both hands flat on his desk. Her name is on the incorporation filings. Yes. Jae-mok's voice was careful, but not softened. Do-yun or his proxies, we believe the third party, was Sung-gil's contact at the offshore firm, forged her signature on the documents 4 years ago. It was a cover architecture. If the offshore structure was ever examined, the named partners created the appearance of legitimate foreign investment, and Amara's American identity gave it a specific credibility because she had no visible connection to Baekryong's criminal operations. They used her as a clean face. Yes, Seong-hwan was quiet. He thought about the 4-year timeline. 4 years ago, Amara had been in the marriage, visible enough to be a credible identity for a financial document, connected enough to his world that her name on a paper would not appear anomalous, and simultaneously isolated enough from the actual mechanics of his operations that she would never encounter evidence that it had been done. Du-yun had been planning for a very long time. And Amara, who had left Seong-hwan's world with one black suitcase and the intention of reclaiming herself, had discovered that his world had followed her into the prosecutor's office and left her name there without her knowledge or consent. "Get the forensic documentation on the signature forgery," Seong-hwan said. "All of it. Handwriting analysis, the chain of the document creation, the timestamp metadata on the digital filings, everything. I want it complete and ready to submit to the prosecutor's office as a supplementary filing within 48 hours. He looked at Jae-mok directly. "Her name comes out of that file. That is the priority. Everything else is secondary to that. The legal team will need to contact her to establish the forgery claim. Not through me. Find her a separate attorney. Someone completely disconnected from this organization. Someone whose only obligation is to her." He paused. "She won't take help from me directly. I know that. But I can make certain she has access to the right resources without it coming from me." Jae-mok studied him for a moment. "You've been thinking about what she needs rather than what you need." "I've been thinking about it since she walked out," Seong-hwan said. "I've been doing it badly and slowly, but I've been doing it." The attorney Celeste found was named Oh Hyun-jae, 44 years old, with a practice in Gwanghwamun that specialized in financial crimes and corporate fraud defense, and whose client list had no visible intersection with Kwon Maritime Holdings. He met Amara at his office at 2 in the afternoon with the patient, unhurried attention of a professional who understands that the first consultation is about establishing trust before it is about establishing facts. He listened to everything she said without interrupting. Then he asked her to walk him through the timeline of her marriage, specifically the financial architecture of it. What accounts she had held, whether she had signed any documents she hadn't fully read, whether she had ever provided identification documents to Seong-hwan's staff or business partners. She had. She'd provided her passport to his administrative team. For some purpose, she couldn't fully remember visa documentation, she thought, or insurance registration approximately 5 years ago. Oh Hyun-jae wrote something on his notepad. "The forgery claim is the strongest path," he said. "If the signature was created using a digital copy of your actual signature from a document you did sign, like a visa application, then forensic analysis can demonstrate that the handwriting is a reproduction rather than an original. The metadata on the incorporation filings should also show inconsistencies with the claimed signing dates if the documents were actually created later and backdated." He set down his pen. "This is resolvable, Ms. Winslow. It will require time and documentation, but the path is clear." "How much time?" "For the prosecutor's supplementary inquiry, if the forgery documentation is submitted properly and promptly, a few months. For full clearance from the record," he paused, professionally honest. 6 months, perhaps more. 6 months, the spring concert was in 4 months. London was in 2 weeks, and in the meantime, she said, "You are not under arrest. You are not a named suspect. You are a named party in a document whose validity is now in question." He looked at her steadily. "You can continue your activities. You can travel. But I would recommend against speaking to any journalists or investigators without me present." She nodded. "There's a journalist, Shin Ji-young. She called me this morning. Don't call her back without me. She may be sympathetic to your position, but her interests and your interests are not identical." He picked up his pen again. "Ms. Winslow, one more thing." She looked at him. "The forensic documentation, the evidence that would most efficiently clear your name, almost certainly exists within Kwon Maritime's own legal files. The evidence they submitted to the prosecutor included the forgery. If we can obtain access to the original submission materials and the evidence chain Kwon Maritime's attorneys assembled, we can use it to establish the forgery more quickly than building it from scratch." He was careful with the next part. "That requires cooperation from Kwon Maritime." Amara looked at her hands in her lap. Her hands, which had calluses reforming on the fingertips. Her hands, which had played the composition that morning in the performance hall and felt for the first time in 20 years like they were fully hers. "I know," she said. She didn't say anything else for a moment. "I'll think about it," she said. The call from Shin Ji-young came again at 6 that evening. Amara, following Oh Hyun-jae's instruction, didn't answer. A sound set green splitting. She sat in Danielle's apartment while the phone rang and thought about lawyers and prosecutors and forged signatures and the offshore companies she'd never heard of that were apparently carrying her name through a criminal investigation like a flag she'd never agreed to fly. Danielle made dinner. Real dinner, not takeout. She cooked the way she approached most practical things, with competence and without excess, and the result was a simple jjigae that filled the apartment with warmth and the smell of something honest. And they sat at Danielle's small table and ate without talking much. Then Danielle said, "You're going to have to call him." Amara didn't pretend not to know what she meant. "I know. Not because you owe him anything, because you need what he has." "I know." Amara looked at her soup. "That's the part that's making me not do it." "The needing him part?" "The needing something from him part." She pushed a piece of tofu around the bowl. "I spent 9 years in a position where he had all the resources, and I operated inside whatever he was willing to provide. And I told myself it was partnership. And it wasn't." She set her spoon down. "If I call him now and ask him to help me, even if it's purely transactional, even if it's just lawyers sharing documents, you're afraid it'll feel like going back. I'm afraid it'll feel like he wins something." Danielle was quiet for a moment. "What does he win if you make a legal call that protects your career and your name and your freedom?" Amara didn't answer immediately. "Nothing," she said finally. "Nothing real." "Then what you're protecting is your pride," Danielle said, not unkindly. "Which I understand. But pride doesn't clear your name from a criminal file." Amara picked up her spoon again. She ate. She thought about the performance hall, about the Steinway, about London and Marcus Webb, and the spring concert at the Sejong Center, and the composition that was almost finished. A sound like green wood splitting, that was 4 months from being played in front of an audience in the space it deserved. That was the most honest thing she had produced in her adult life. She thought about what it would mean for all of that, if the legal situation went wrong. She picked up her phone. She dialed. He answered before the first ring had finished. Which meant he'd been waiting. Which meant he'd known she would call eventually. Which told her something about how well he still knew her, which was complicated information to receive. "Amara," he said, the sound of her name in his voice, in the particular way he said it, not performing, not calculating, just saying it hit her in a way she wasn't prepared for, and she absorbed it without letting it into her voice. "I need your legal files," she said. "The original submission to the prosecutor. The evidence chain documentation. Everything related to the offshore companies that have my name on them." Her voice was steady. "My attorney needs it to establish the forgery. I'm not asking for anything else. I'm not coming back. I'm not having a conversation about us. I need documents, and your attorneys have them." A brief silence. Not hesitation. Seong-hwan has already made the decision. She could hear it in the quality of the silence of a man who is listening rather than calculating. "You'll have them tomorrow morning," he said. "Delivered to whatever address you give me for your attorney. Oh Han-jae. His office is in Gwangwon. I'll text you the address." Amara. She waited. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not for the legal situation specifically. For the whole thing. For the architecture of the life we built that made it possible for someone to use your name and count on you, not knowing." A pause. "I built a world that kept you at a distance from its edges, and then the edges used that distance against you." She listened to him say it. She didn't cry. She wasn't going to cry. She was not standing in Danielle's kitchen at 6:45 in the evening and crying about Kwon Seong-hwan. "Text me Oh Han-jae's office address," Seong-hwan said. "You'll have everything by 9 tomorrow." He ended the call before she could. She stood with the phone in her hand for a moment. Then she opened a text message and sent him the attorney's address and put the phone face down on the counter and went back to the table where Danielle was sitting with the tactful stillness of a person who had heard everything but was going to wait to be told what she needed to know. He's sending the files, Amara said. Danielle nodded. I need to go practice, Amara said. It's 7 at night. I know. She picked up her bag and her coat and went back to the Sejong Center, where the night security let her in because Celeste had already arranged her access, and she sat down at the Steinway in the dark performance hall and turned on only the piano's music stand light and played for 2 hours in the circle of it, the composition coming out of her hands with more urgency than it had all week. Pushed by something she would not name, but could feel driving every phrase forward with a kind of desperation, the playing of a person who has understood with fresh and painful clarity exactly what she is fighting to protect. When she finally stopped, the hall was completely silent around her. She sat in the silence. Then she pulled out her composition notebook and wrote for 40 minutes in the margin of the third movement, noting fingering changes and dynamic shifts and a rhythmic adjustment in the final passage that she'd been circling for days without landing on. And when she wrote it down this time, it was right. She knew it was right. It was the thing the passage had been waiting for. She closed the notebook. She looked out at the empty seats of the performance hall, row after row of them, disappearing into darkness, 1,200 seats for an audience that didn't exist yet. In 4 months, they would be full. Whatever it took, they were going to be full. She picked up her bag and walked out of the building into the Seoul night, and the city was cold and enormous and indifferent around her, and she walked through it without a driver, without a security detail, a sound like green wood splitting without anyone monitoring her route or managing her arrival. And when she reached the street, she turned in the direction of Mapogu and started walking home. The files arrived at Oh Hyun-jae's office at 8:47 in the morning. Not at 9, 8:47, which meant Seong-hwan had instructed his attorneys to begin the transfer before the building's normal operating hours, which meant someone had been in Kwon Maritime's legal department before 8 a. Pulling documentation, which meant he had made this the first thing. Before anything else. Before whatever else was on his calendar. Before whatever the organization needed from him that morning. Amara found out from Oh Hyun-jae's text at 9:15 while she was drinking coffee in the Sejong Center's practice corridor, waiting for the hall to become available. She read the text twice. She put her phone in her bag and went into practice. She played for 3 hours. The files, as Oh Hyun-jae explained to her that afternoon in his Gwangwon office, were comprehensive to the point of being almost aggressively complete. Every document in the offshore company chain, every filing, every timestamp, the full forensic analysis that Kwon Maritime's own attorneys had commissioned to establish that the companies were created by Do Yun's network, an analysis that, as a necessary product of its own logic, also established the mechanism by which Amara's identity had been used without her knowledge. Oh Hyun-jae set his reading glasses on the desk. The signature forgery documentation is definitive, he said. Kwon Maritime's forensic team used a handwriting analysis specialist and digital metadata reconstruction. Your actual signature from a legitimate document you signed in 2019, a residential insurance registration, was digitally replicated and applied to the offshore filings. The metadata on the incorporation documents shows they were created on dates that conflict with the claimed signing dates. The conflict is significant. We're talking about documents that claim to have been signed in person on a date when you were demonstrably in Tokyo. Amara looked at the page. He turned toward her. She looked at her own name on the incorporation filing and felt a particular cold sensation move through her, not fear exactly, but its close neighbor, the feeling of having been handled by forces that operated entirely outside your awareness or consent. How long to submit the supplementary filing? She said. I can have it ready by the end of the week. The prosecutor's office will review. Given the quality of the forensic documentation, I'm optimistic the supplementary inquiry closes within 8 to 10 weeks. He paused. Your name should not materially affect your professional activities in the interim. The inquiry is preliminary and the document is not public. Shin Ji-young knows about it. Then we should consider getting ahead of the story. He leaned forward slightly. There is a version of this where you speak publicly carefully with counsel before she publishes it. It removes her ability to define the narrative. Amara thought about London, about the spring concert, About 2 million people who had stopped scrolling to listen to 90 seconds of her playing through a practice room door. Let me think about the public statement, she said. Submit the filing first. She stood up and pulled on her coat. Then she stopped. Attorney. Oh, she said. He looked up. Is there any exposure remaining? Any scenario where this doesn't resolve? He was honest, which was why she was paying him. There is one scenario. If Hayren surfaces and attempts to use the offshore documentation as leverage, if she provides the recordings to the prosecutor or to a journalist before we've cleared your name from the file, there is a window where the narrative becomes more complicated. He paused. But her incentive to surface the recordings decreases as our supplementary filing progresses. The recordings implicate her own operation more than they implicate you. She would be identifying herself and providing evidence of her own coordination with Do Yoon. So she's trapped too, in a manner of speaking. Yes. Amara buttoned her coat. Find her, she said. Oh, Hyunjae blinked. I'm sorry? I don't mean physically, I mean monitor. If there's a way to know where those recordings are and whether they're moving toward publication, I need to know. She looked at him steadily. I'm 4 months from a performance that represents 20 years of work. I am not going to let a woman I never did anything to use my name to blow it up. Oh Hyunjae looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite surprise, more like revised estimation. I'll look into monitoring services, he said, within legal bounds. Of course, Amara said. She called Marcus Webb from the street outside Oh Hyunjae's building. The London air on his end of the call was audible in the background traffic, the particular frequency of city noise that was distinctly different from Seoul's version. There's a legal matter, she said. Nothing involving me directly. My name is in a document it shouldn't be in, and my attorney is correcting it. I need you to know before we meet. A pause on Marcus's end. She could hear him processing, not panicking, which she respected, just processing. Does it affect the recording? He said. Not if we move on the timeline we discussed. And the concert in March? Nothing is affecting the concert in March. Another pause. Do you need more time before London? No. She said it without hesitation, because hesitation was the thing that opened doors she didn't want open. 2 weeks, as planned. All right, Marcus said. The particular quality of his all right told her. He believed her, which was either a testament to her delivery or to his own read of people, probably some combination of both. 2 weeks, she ended the call. She stood on the Gwanghwamun pavement in November cold and looked up at the overcast sky above the city and felt with the particular raw clarity that had been her permanent companion since the night she left Seong-hwan's house that she was. Playing a game on multiple surfaces simultaneously, the music and the law and the public narrative and the London trip and the spring concert and the composition that still had one movement left to complete, and that all of these surfaces were live at once, and any one of them could collapse and take the others with it. She took a breath. Then she went back to the Sejong Center and practiced for 4 more hours. The concert. Not the spring concert that was 4 months away. The smaller one, which Celeste had scheduled for the 3rd week of November, a featured solo evening in the conservatory's own 200-seat recital hall, which had been put together partly as a professional showcase and partly, Amara understood, as a controlled environment in which to field the attention that the viral video had generated before that tension organized itself without her input. 200 seats. Celeste had the ticket allocation filled within 6 hours of announcing it. Seong-hwan bought 1 ticket. Amara found out from Celeste, who told her with the careful neutrality of a woman delivering information she considers relevant, but whose implications she's deliberately not editorializing on. He bought it through the public allocation, Celeste said. General seating. No special accommodation requested. She looked at Amara across her desk with steady attention. I thought you should know. Did you consider not telling me? Briefly. A pause. Then I decided you'd find out anyway, and it would be better to hear it without the additional complication of discovering I'd known. Amara was quiet for a moment. He's not being asked to leave, she said. It wasn't a question exactly, more like thinking out loud about her own position. He bought a public ticket to a public event, Celeste said. I'm not going to remove him from general seating. She paused. unless you ask me to. Amara thought about it. No, she said. Leave it. The recital hall was full on a Tuesday evening in mid-November, the 200 seats occupied by a mix of conservatory patrons, arts press, the two Korean outlet journalists who'd been in Celeste's inquiry queue, a sound what appeared to be a significant contingent of people who had found the ticket allocation through the viral video's comment threads, a sound which meant they were primarily in their 20s and had come with the particular alert energy of an audience that has made a decision to be somewhere based on an emotional response rather than a professional obligation. Amara stood backstage in the simple midnight blue dress she'd bought at a Mapo-gu boutique the previous Saturday, not expensive, not Hanamdong, and listened to the hall settle. Danielle was in the third row. Oh Hyunjae was in the seventh. Celeste was standing at the back. She didn't look for Seong-hwan. She went on stage. The applause was immediate and warm, and she stood at the front of the stage and felt it come at her, and felt something absorb it that had been empty for a very long time. Then she sat at the piano, which was a Yamaha concert, grand, significantly humbler than the Sejong Center Steinway, but properly tuned and more than adequate for what she was going to do with it, and she placed her hands on the keys and waited one beat, one complete empty beat in which the hall went from warm applause to absolute stillness, and then she played. She played for 90 minutes. She moved through repertoire she'd spent 2 weeks reconstructing from her performance years. Chopin Ravel, a Gershwin arrangement she'd worked up at 23 for an Atlanta showcase and hadn't played since. She played them the way they existed now in her hands, filtered through everything the 9 years had deposited in her and everything the past 2 months of daily practice had returned to her. And the result was something that was not what she'd played in her 20s, was technically both less and more than that, more human and less controlled, and considerably more honest. Then she played the composition, the incomplete version, the version that had everything except the final resolution she hadn't finished writing yet. She played it through to the point where it currently ended, not a stopping place. Exactly, but an edge, a place where the music arrived at something it was going to say, and then didn't quite say yet. A sound like green wood splitting, which she'd decided would communicate more tonight than performing something that wasn't ready would have. The hall was silent for 4 full seconds after she lifted her hands. Then the 200 people in the room stood up. She sat at the piano and let the standing ovation come at her, and felt it move through her chest, and she didn't cry. She wasn't going to cry, but her hands were pressed flat against her thighs under the piano lid, and she could feel them shaking slightly, and she let them shake because there was nobody at the piano except her, and it didn't need to be managed. She stood and took her bow. Backstage, the receiving line was the conservatory's structure, and she moved through it journalists, patrons, Celeste board members with the professional warmth she'd spent a decade deploying at Seong-hwan's dinners for his guests, and was now deploying for the first time in service of something that was entirely her own. She felt him before she saw him. That was the honest truth, and she didn't dress it up. She felt the particular quality of attention, the stillness at the edge of a crowd, that belonged specifically to him, and she turned, and he was there at the back of the backstage corridor, and he was alone. No security detail, no assistant, no buffer, just Kwon Seong-hwan in a dark jacket with his hands at his sides, standing by the wall the way a man stands when he's made a decision not to take up any more space than the wall provides him. The journalist from the Korea Arts Review was still beside her. Amara finished the sentence she was in the middle of, and then excused herself and walked to the back of the corridor. Seong-hwan watched her approach. He didn't move toward her. He waited. She stopped 3 feet from him. "You came," she said. "I should have heard you years ago." His voice was quiet, and even and without the particular management she'd grown accustomed to in his voice without the filtering. "I wanted you to know I understand that now. Not because knowing it changes anything. Because it's true." Amara looked at him. She looked at the man she'd spent 9 years beside. Really looked, the way she sometimes hadn't been able to look because proximity makes looking difficult, and the years of distance had given her something she hadn't had inside the marriage, which was the ability to see him without the immediate press of everything they were to each other distorting the view. He looked tired, not unhealthy. Tired in the way of someone who has been conducting a genuine reckoning, and reckonings are not restful. I know, she said. Then she walked back to the journalists. He left before the crowd had fully cleared. She saw him go from across the room, a brief gap in the bodies, the corridor door closing behind him. She watched it close. She turned back to the journalist and answered the next question. 3 weeks later, in early December, the supplementary filing landed in the prosecutor's office with the forensic documentation attached. Oh Hyun-jae called her the morning it was submitted. Clean package, he said. The metadata analysis is thorough and the handwriting comparison is definitive. The prosecutor's team will review, but I have no reason to expect complications. Timeline? 8 weeks. Probably closer to 6 if the review moves efficiently. She was in London the following week. Marcus Webb's office was in a Georgian building in Marylebone that smelled of old paper and good coffee and the specific air of a space where decisions get made by people who understand what decisions cost. Marcus himself was shorter than she'd expected from the voice, with reading glasses pushed up on his head and the relaxed intensity of someone who is always partially thinking about something else. They spent 4 hours at his conference table. He played her 3 recordings from his existing artist roster, not to show her what she should sound like. He was explicit about that, but to give her a vocabulary for discussing what she didn't want, which he said was more useful than discussing what she did. She told him about the composition, the complete version, the March concert. He listened without interrupting, which she had now identified as his tell the thing Marcus Webb did when he was paying full attention rather than partial attention, was that he went completely still. I want the album to be the composition and the repertoire from November, she said. In that order, the composition last. Recorded where? Seoul. I need to be in Seoul. He didn't push back on it. We'll find a studio. I want the March concert recorded live. As a separate release or as a bonus, that's your call. But I want the room on the recording. I want the 1,200 seats audible in it. He wrote something on his notepad. The incomplete version you performed in November will be complete by March. He looked up. You're sure? I have the last section. I wrote it last week. She paused. I haven't played it yet for anyone, but it's there. Marcus studied her for a moment with the assessing attention she'd now learned to read as his version of genuine respect. All right, he said. He held out his hand across the conference table. Let's make the record. She shook it. She flew back to Seoul on a Thursday and was in the practice hall by Friday morning. December light through the performance hall's high windows was thin and lateral. The winter sun staying low, and the Steinway in that light looked like a different instrument than it had. In October, darker, more contained, the lacquer reflecting the gray instead of the gold. She sat down. She opened her composition notebook to the section she'd written in Marcus's hotel near Heathrow. In a small room at 1 a.m. after the meeting, sitting on the edge of the bed with the notebook on her knee, writing for 40 minutes until the final passage was there on the paper, complete. She'd looked at it for a long time that night. She hadn't been sure it was right, not because it was bad, but because it was unexpected. The passage she'd written was not the resolution she would have written at 26. At 26, she'd imagined the composition ending with the forward motion that had always defined it, arriving at a clear destination, an arrival, a landing, something unambiguous and declarative. The ending she'd written in the Heathrow hotel room didn't do that. It arrived somewhere, but the somewhere was open rather than closed. It resolved without concluding. It ended with the music asking a question that the listener would have to answer themselves. She'd sat with it for a long time. Then she'd decided it was right precisely because it wasn't what she would have written at 26. She placed her hands on the keys now and played through the first 2 movements slowly, feeling the morning warmth coming into her fingers as she went, and then the 3rd movement, and then the new passage, the ending, she'd written in a Heathrow hotel room, and when she arrived at it, she let it come out of her hands the way it had been on the paper, carefully. At first and then with more commitment, and then completely, the music finding its own relationship with the performance hall's acoustic, the way music does when the space is large enough to let it be fully itself. She finished. The hall was silent. She sat with her hands in her lap, and the silence around her, and thought, this is right. Not perfect, not finished in the sense of requiring no further refinement, but fundamentally, structurally right, in the way that things are right when they are telling the truth. The story broke in mid-December. Not Shin Ji-young's story that had been quietly shelved, Oh Hyun-jae informed her, likely because the supplementary filing had removed the version of the narrative that was most useful to the journalist's purposes. The story that broke was a different one, filed by Korean business press outlet that had been tracking the Kwon maritime fraud prosecution. Baek Do-yeon and his brother Baek Sung-il had both been formally charged. The So-and-so organization's sole operations had been disrupted by a financial crimes investigation that traced back to the offshore network. The article named Yoon Hae-rin as a person of interest currently outside Korean jurisdiction. Amara read the article once. She noted that her name did not appear in it. She forwarded it to Oh Hyun-jae with a single-line message. Is this going to complicate the supplementary review? He replied within the hour, no, this accelerates it. The formal charges against Do-yeon and Sung-il corroborate our forgery documentation. Revised timeline, 4 weeks. 4 weeks. She put her phone down and went back to the piano. January moved fast. The supplementary filing was approved in the 3rd week of January. Oh Hyun-jae called at 2 in the afternoon on a Wednesday while Amara was in the middle of a teaching session, and she stepped out of the room to take it, and he said, "It's done," in a voice that had the quiet satisfaction of a professional completing work he'd done properly, and she said, "Thank you," and went back into the classroom. She told her advanced students that afternoon, Soo-yeon and Jina, who had become, over the 4 months of their work together, the kind of students who could tell when their teacher was carrying something from outside the room. "You're okay," Soo-yeon said. It was not a question. "I'm okay," Amara said. "The concert is in 8 weeks," Jina said. 7 weeks and 4 days. Jina almost smiled. "Are you going to be ready?" "I've been ready for 20 years, Amara said. "I just needed to find my way back to it." 6 weeks before the concert, Seong-hwan sent the letter. She came back to Danielle's apartment on a Tuesday afternoon to find an envelope on the kitchen table that Danielle had clearly placed there with deliberate neutrality, no comment, no staging, just the envelope positioned in the center of the table so that it was visible but not presented, and Danielle herself was out, which was the most Danielle thing she could have done. The envelope had her name on it in his handwriting. She looked at it for a while. She made tea. She sat at the table. She opened the envelope. The letter was handwritten on plain white paper, 4 pages, and it had none of the quality of a composed document. There were crossed-out words, marginal corrections, places where the pen pressure changed, when the thought changed. All the evidence of something written in real time by a person who was not performing the act of writing, but was genuinely trying to accomplish something through it. She read it. Then she read it again. He wrote about the dinner where they'd met. He wrote about the specific moment he'd first heard her play in the second reception room. The first year, a sound and home earlier than expected, and found her at the piano and stood in the doorway for a long time, without announcing himself. Without announcing himself because something about the playing had stopped him. He wrote about the way he'd registered that moment as pleasant, rather than as the evidence of something extraordinary that it was, and the way that misreading had repeated itself in 100 subsequent moments across 9 years until the misreading became the truth they lived inside. He wrote about his mother's phone call. He wrote about watching a million people stop to listen to something he had heard and failed to hear for a decade. He wrote, "I did not lose you. I released you, incrementally, over years of small decisions to give my attention to everything I considered important. I am trying to understand what that means about the kind of person I was. I am not asking you to tell me," he wrote. "I am not asking you to come back. I am not asking for another conversation. I am writing this because I could not call it a real reckoning if I said none of it to you directly, and because you deserve to hear the full shape of what I understand I did, not the managed version." The last page contained 1 paragraph. "The Hanam-dong house has been sold. I've been restructuring the organization toward legitimate operations for 3 months now. These are not things I'm telling you to demonstrate change. They're things I'm doing because they're right and they were overdue. I'm telling you because you spent 9 years living in the middle of something I built, and you deserved to know its real shape then, and you deserve to know its new direction now. A sound like green wood splitting. I should have told you everything directly, without asking you to absorb it in service of something I needed. Inside this envelope with the letter was his wedding band. Amara looked at the ring in the palm of her hand. She looked at it for a long time. She folded the letter. She put it and the ring back in the envelope. She set the envelope on Danielle's bookshelf. She picked up her composition notebook and her bag and her coat, and she went back to the Sejong Center because the concert was in 6 weeks, and the composition needed 2 more complete run-throughs at full performance tempo today, and the Steinway had been waiting since morning. She played until 9 that evening. When she finally stopped, and the performance hall settled into its nighttime quiet around her, she sat at the piano for a long time without moving, the composition still humming in the air around her. The 1,200 empty seats arranged in their patient rows, and she felt the weight of everything the Natkin, and she felt the weight of everything the 4 months had required of her, the legal fight and the London meeting and the teaching and the practice and the grief that wasn't clean grief and the anger that was sometimes necessary and sometimes just exhausting. She felt all of it at once, the full accumulated weight of it, and she let herself feel it completely, for exactly as long as it took her to take 3 slow breaths. Then she closed the piano lid. She pulled out her phone. She looked at Seong-hwan's contact entry. She did not call. She typed, "I read it. Thank you for writing it." She looked at the words. She sent them. She put the phone in her bag and stood up and collected her things and walked out of the performance hall and through the Sejong Center lobby and out into the Seoul winter night, where the city was doing what it always did, enormous and lit and relentlessly itself. And she walked in the direction of Mapo-gu, with her composition notebook pressed against her chest and her breath making small white clouds in the cold air. And the concert 5 weeks and 6 days away, and everything she was fighting for, still exactly in front of her, unfinished, alive, waiting to be played. Her phone buzzed once in her bag. She didn't stop walking to check it. She already knew what it said. His reply had said, "I know." 2 words. She'd read them standing outside the Sejong Center at 9:43 in the evening, with the Seoul winter pressing against the back of her neck, and she'd stood there with the phone in her hand long enough that a passing couple had briefly looked at her. A woman standing motionless on the pavement, staring at a screen, and then looked away. Because Seoul was a city that had learned to give people the privacy of their still moments. She put the phone in her bag and walked home. She did not think about what "I know" meant for the rest of that night. She had trained herself, over the months since leaving Hanamdong, to manage the bandwidth of her own attention the way she managed practice time, with discipline, with structure, with the understanding that some material needed to be sequenced rather than processed all at once. The concert was 5 weeks and 6 days away. The composition was ready. Those were the facts that required her focus, and she gave them her focus, and she did not think about Seong-hwan again until the morning she found herself thinking about him without deciding to, which was 3 days later, on a Friday, sitting in the practice hall with her hands on the Steinway keys and the composition open on the stand, and then strange involuntary certainty arriving in her that she was going to call him, not today, but soon, a sound like green wood splitting, and that the call was not going to be about legal documents or letters or wedding bands returned in envelopes, but about something she didn't have the language for yet and would need to find. She filed that away. She played. The 5 weeks before the concert were the most concentrated period of work she'd done since her 20s. She was in the practice hall 6 days a week, never fewer than 5 hours, sometimes 8. She worked the composition until every passage was not just technically secure, but emotionally inhabited, until she could play each section from inside it rather than over it, which was a distinction that mattered enormously in performance, and that no amount of technical repetition could substitute for. She worked the supporting repertoire. She worked the sequencing, the architecture of the 2-hour program, the way one piece prepared the ear for the next, the way she wanted the concert to build, not to a climax exactly, because the composition was not a climax. It was a completion, a different thing, but to an arrival, the sense of a long journey landing somewhere earned. Celeste came to 2 of the practice sessions and sat in the back of the hall, with her hands folded, and said nothing during, and offered specific observations after. Not about the music, but about the performance, about what was visible from the hall versus what Amara was experiencing at the instrument, about the places where her physical presence communicated something different from what the music was saying, about the final passage of the composition, which Celeste heard twice, and then sat with in silence for a long time before saying, simply, "That's the right ending." "You think so," Amara said. "It doesn't ask for applause," Celeste said. "It asks for thought. That's harder to write and harder to play. You wrote it and you can play it." She paused. "Don't change it." Amara didn't change it. Marcus Webb flew in from London 10 days before the concert. He brought his recording engineer, a quiet Finnish man named Laurie, who communicated primarily through a series of decisive nods and the occasional precise question. And they spent an afternoon in the performance hall running acoustic tests and discussing the placement of recording equipment which would be present for the live concert, as Marcus had requested. Laurie walked the hall with a measuring device and a focused expression, and occasionally said things like 4 meters left of center or the upper balcony reflects differently than the house spec suggests. And Marcus translated these observations for Amara as confirmation that Laurie was pleased, which apparently involved a more rigorous process than it sounded. "The hall is better than I expected," Marcus told her afterward over coffee in the Sejong Center's lobby. "It's going to sound right. It's a good room," she said. "I mean the recording, the live recording, the one we're releasing." He looked at her steadily. "How are you feeling about March 10th? Like it's 20 years overdue and exactly on time," she said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Then that's the right answer." 6 days before the concert, Hae-rin surfaced. Not physically, she was still outside Korean jurisdiction, location unconfirmed. But she surfaced in the sense that Oh Hyun-jae called Amara at 7 in the morning with the particular controlled urgency of a professional managing a situation that has just changed shape. "She's made contact," he said, "not with the prosecutor's office. With Shin Ji-young." Amara was already sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, which she set down carefully. The journalist. She provided Shin with a partial transcript of one of the audio recordings. "The transcript was shared with our monitoring contact last night." Oh Hyun-jae paused. "The recording is from Seong-hwan's private office, approximately 18 months ago. It's a conversation between him and 2 of his senior people about territorial operations. It contains language that would be, if published, significantly damaging to Kwon Maritime's legitimate restructuring claims. It doesn't involve me. Correct. You are not on the recording. But Shin is now sitting on material that she can publish at any point, and she's indicated to our contact that she's looking for corroborating context before she runs the story." He paused again, the pause of a lawyer, who's about to say something he's certain is true, but knows will not be easy to hear. "The concert is in 6 days. If this story publishes in that window, even without your name in it, the connection to your marriage, the timing, the public profile you've built over the past 4 months, it will be in the story by association. Every profile, every review, every mention of the March concert will include a reference to the Kwon Maritime recordings." Amara looked at her coffee. "She's trying to pull you into it," Danielle said from the doorway. She'd come out of her bedroom at some point in the call, drawn by the quality of Amara's silence. "Hae-rin, she's not going after Seong-hwan directly. She's going around to you." Amara looked at Danielle. Then she said into the phone, "What does Seong-hwan know about this?" "His legal team was informed simultaneously with ours," Oh Hyun-jae said. "He's likely aware as of this morning. What are our options?" 3. 1. We do nothing and wait to see if Shin publishes. She may not without corroborating context. The story is weaker than Hae-rin is representing it. 2. We approach Shin proactively and offer context, which means entering the story voluntarily but shaping it. 3. He stopped. 3. Amara said. 3 is that Seong-hwan's legal team negotiates with Hae-rin directly. She's using the recordings as leverage, as I predicted, as insurance against being pursued. If Kwon Maritime formally commits to not pursuing her through Korean legal channels, she loses the primary incentive to release the material. He was careful here. That decision belongs entirely to Seong-hwan. It's his recordings, his organization, his call. I can't recommend it as a clean resolution because it involves him choosing not to pursue a legitimate criminal target. But practically speaking, it would end the immediate threat. Amara sat with this. 6 days. She had 6 days before the concert that represented 20 years of delayed life. She had a complete composition. She had 1,200 seats sold. She had Marcus Webb's recording engineer already, in Seoul, setting up equipment. She had 20 years of silence that were about to end. "Call me back in an hour," she told Oh Hyun-jae and ended the call. She looked at Danielle. "I need to call him," she said. "Yes," Danielle said. She called. He answered the way he'd answered every call since she left before the first ring finished, which had initially felt like calculation and now felt like what it probably was, which was a man who had stopped pretending he wasn't waiting. "I know about Shin," he said immediately. "My attorneys told me 20 minutes ago." "I know." She got up from the table and walked to Danielle's window. Below, the Mapogu Street was doing its morning things, a delivery truck double-parked, a woman walking a small dog, the ordinary machinery of a neighborhood that had no idea what was happening 5 floors above it. "I'm not calling to ask you to protect me. I'm calling because this affects you significantly more than it affects me, and I think you should know what I think before you make your decision." A brief silence. "All right. Don't let her go," Amara said. "Don't make a deal with her. Whatever she's holding, whatever damage it does, handle it the right way. The same way you've been handling everything else the past 4 months." She pressed her fingertips against the cold glass of the window. "You started doing things properly. Don't stop because she's pressuring you. She's counting on the pressure working. Don't let it work." The silence on his end lasted longer this time. "The story is going to mention you," he said. "Even without your name directly. The associations." "No, the concert. The concert is in 6 days," Amara said. "And I've been building toward it for 20 years. If it gets mentioned in the same paragraph as a criminal investigation, that's going to be true regardless of what deal you make. Because deals like that become stories too." She kept her voice even. "I would rather the concert exist in a complicated context than have it exist because someone bought silence." She could hear him breathing, not distressed, the particular quality of someone, absorbing something carefully. "Amara," he said. "Don't make the deal," she said. "That's all I'm saying." She ended the call. She stood at Danielle's window for a moment longer. Then she picked up her bag, put on her coat, and went to practice. Seong-hwan did not make the deal. Oh Hyun-jae called her 2 days later to tell that Kwon Maritime's legal team had declined Hae-rin's implicit offer and had instead formally requested that Interpol update her status as a person of interest, which was a move that communicated to anyone paying attention that the approach of using the recordings as leverage had not achieved its intended effect, and was now more likely to result in her pursuit than in her protection. Shin Ji-young published nothing in the window but before the concert. Oh Hyun-jae's assessment was that without Hae-rin's cooperation, and with the corroborating context unavailable, the story was not sufficiently solid for a publication of Shin standards. He said this with the measured satisfaction of a man who had correctly assessed a situation and managed it to the right outcome. Amara said thank you and went back to the Steinway. The morning of the concert, she woke before her alarm. She lay on Danielle's fold-out couch. She'd been sleeping on it for 4 months and had stopped noticing its particular topology of springs, which she took as evidence of what the human body is capable of adapting to given sufficient time and motivation, and she looked at the ceiling and let herself feel, fully and without management, what was true about this day. She was 35 years old. She had spent 9 years becoming someone's wife, in a way that had required becoming less of herself. She had left with 1 suitcase and a composition she hadn't touched in nearly a decade. She had lived on a fold-out couch in Mapogu and learned to drink different coffee and practiced on an out-of-tune to come upright at 4 in the morning and fought a legal situation she hadn't created and found her way to a Steinway Model D in the Sejong Center's performance hall and written the ending she hadn't been able to write at 26. Tonight, 1,200 people were going to sit in seats and listen to what all of that had produced. She got up. She made coffee. She sat at Danielle's table in the early morning quiet and drank it without her phone, without the composition notebook, without preparation. She let the morning be what it was. Outside the window, Seoul was coming on the first sounds of the street, the particular quality of city light at 7 a.m. in March, when winter is releasing its grip, and you can feel the temperature changing by degrees too small to name, but that accumulate into something you eventually notice. Danielle emerged at 7:30 with her hair in all directions, and looked at Amara at the table with the specific fond recognition of a person who has watched someone they fight, a long fight, and has shown up for every round of it. "Today," Danielle said. "Today," Amara said. Danielle sat down across from her. She didn't say anything else for a while. She poured herself coffee and sat with it and looked at Amara with the quiet attention of someone who understands that some moments don't need to be narrated. "I'm not scared," Amara said. "I know, I thought I would be." "You've been preparing for 20 years, Danielle said. "Your body knows what to do." Amara looked at her coffee cup. The ordinary one from Danielle's cabinet, plain white, slightly chipped at the handle, the kind of cup that exists in kitchens everywhere without any intention of being meaningful. She thought about the Osaka cup, the one Heirin had been drinking from. She thought about the fact that somewhere in the Hanam-dong mansion's inventory, packed into storage or left behind in the sale, that cup probably still existed, that the cup hadn't been destroyed by what happened around it, that it was just a cup, that what she'd invested in it had been real, and the thing that had shattered it had been real, and both of those things could be true at the same time. "I'm going to buy a new cup," she said. Danielle looked at her. "After tonight," Amara said, "I want to find a ceramics place somewhere and buy a cup that I chose on a day when I wasn't building a life inside someone else's. Something I carry out of a shop on a completely ordinary afternoon." She paused. "That's what I want to do after tonight." Danielle smiled, the real one, the unself-conscious one that arrived on her face when something landed exactly right. "Then that's what we're doing tomorrow," she said. The Sejong Center Performance Hall filled from the back forward. Amara didn't watch it. She was backstage in a small green room with a mirror and a piano that was not the Steinway, and a glass of water she kept picking up and putting down without drinking from. Celeste came in at 7:15 and looked at her once and said, "You're ready," and left, which was the most efficient piece of pre-performance communication Amara had ever received. Lori, the recording engineer, knocked at 7:30 to confirm the equipment was live, and the sound check had been completed, and everything was in his one-word assessment correct, delivered with the nod that apparently constituted his highest expression of professional satisfaction. Marcus was in the 3rd row. Danielle was in the 5th. Oh Hyun-jae was in the 9th. Soo-yeon and Ji-na, her advanced students, who had in 4 months of work together become something that didn't have a clean professional category, something closer to witnesses of a process, were in the 11th row, side by side, with the careful, composed attention of young musicians who understood what they were about to hear. Mi-suk was in the 14th row. Amara found out about that afterward. She didn't know at the time. Seong-hwan's mother had purchased a ticket through the public allocation not seating, an assigned seat in the orchestra section, and she had come alone and sat without announcing herself to anyone. And afterward, when Amara was told, she sat with that information for a long time and felt something complex and unresolved and real move through her about it. Seong-hwan was in the back. He was in the last row of the orchestra section, on the aisle, which was where someone sits when they're leaving themselves the option of not being noticed and also the option of leaving without disruption if the situation requires it. He wore the same dark jacket he'd worn backstage at the conservatory recital. No security, no assistant. He sat with his hands on his knees and he watched the stage. Amara didn't know he was there when she walked out. She walked onto the stage at 8 o'clock exactly, and the 1,200 people in the Sejong Center Hall gave her the kind of applause that arrives when an audience has been waiting for someone, not just the polite professional applause of concert-goers acknowledging a performer, but the warm, already invested response of people who had stood in digital hallways for 90 seconds and couldn't move, and had then bought tickets in 6 hours and had been anticipating this evening for weeks. She stood at the front of the stage and received it. She looked out at 1,200 faces. She couldn't individually see past the stage lights, but could sense as a presence, as the particular atmospheric weight of a room full of people who are paying full attention, and she felt it move into her, the way sound moves into a room, filling the available space, changing the acoustic, becoming part of what was already there. Then she sat at the Steinway. She placed her hands on the keys. She played. The program ran 2 hours and 11 minutes. She played the Chopin First, the Ballade No. 1, which she'd chosen as the opening because it began quietly and contained everything within itself, because it earned its own enormity rather than asserting it, because it was the piece she had technically over-prepared and could therefore play with complete freedom, the kind of freedom that only exists on the other side of absolute preparation. She played the Ravel. She played the Gershwin arrangement that she'd rebuilt from memory and then rebuilt again from a better memory, the version she'd played at 23 improved by the 23 years since. Intermission. She came back. She played 3 shorter pieces of Debussy she'd loved since she was a teenager, a Korean contemporary work that Celeste had suggested, and that had turned out to be exactly right. A Bach prelude that she'd played for the first time at age 8, and that now sounded to her like a conversation she'd been having with herself across her entire life. Then she stopped. The hall was completely quiet. She sat at the piano without playing for perhaps 10 seconds, which is a very long time in a room of 1,200 people. She didn't do it for effect. She did it because she needed one beat of honest silence between everything that had come before and what was coming next. One beat to mark the separation, the way you mark the edge of something important by pausing at it before you cross. Then she began the composition. She played it from the beginning, from the opening phrase that had been the piece's center of gravity since she was 26, and had only deepened since, and she played it through all 3 movements that she'd spent 4 months rebuilding, not performing the music, but being inside it, letting it pass through her rather than directing it, which was the thing that couldn't be manufactured and couldn't be rushed and had finally come back to her, fully, only in the past month, in the final weeks of practice, when the preparation had stopped being work and started being something she didn't have a word for, except true. The hall was silent in a way that felt actively generated rather than passive. The silence of 1,200 people choosing not to make sound, which is different from the absence of sound and can be felt by the person on stage as clearly as applause. She reached the 3rd movement. She played the transitional passage that had resisted her for weeks in October and had finally opened. She played it the way it wanted to be played. A sound like green wood splitting, with the specific quality of release she'd spent months searching for and had found in a moment she couldn't have engineered, found it playing in the dark practice room at 4 in the morning, the way you find things in the by moving toward them without being able to see them until your hands close around them. She reached the final passage, the one she'd written, in a Heathrow hotel room at 1 in the morning. The one Celeste had heard and said, "That's the right ending. Don't change it." She played it. The music moved through the hall, and she could feel it moving, could feel the acoustics receiving it, the Steinway transmitting it, Laurie's microphones capturing it, and underneath all of that, the thing that none of the technical apparatus could capture, which was the 20 years of living that were passing through her hands, and out into the room where 1,200 people were sitting in complete silence, not because they'd been asked to be quiet, but because they didn't want to interrupt. The final passage resolved, not into a landing, into an opening. The music asked its question, and then it was quiet, and the quiet was the answer, and the answer was the listeners. She lifted her hands from the keys. The hall was silent for 5 seconds. Then 1,200 people stood up at the same time. She sat at the piano and let the standing ovation come. She felt it move through her sternum and her hands and the back of her throat, and she pressed her feet flat against the floor and her palms flat against her thighs, and she breathed, deliberately and slowly, a sound like green wood splitting, and she let the tears come that had been waiting since February, when she first played the new ending through completely alone in the practice hall and understood what she'd built. She let them come now without managing them, without composing her face into something more professional, because there was nobody at the piano except her and 1,200 people who had just listened to 20 years of her life and were standing up because of it. She stood. She took her bow. She looked out into the lit hall. The first time she'd really seen the audience since walking on stage, the house lights coming up slowly as the applause continued, and she saw row after row of standing people, faces she didn't know and would never know, and she felt toward them something she didn't have the English word for, something that the music itself had better language for. The thing that happens when a stranger hears you completely and you know it. Backstage was warm and crowded, and Danielle reached her first, not saying anything, just putting both hands on the sides of her face for a moment with the wordless directness that was her specific form of love. Then Marcus, who shook her hand and then reconsidered, and gave her a brief, uncharacteristic hug and said, "The recording is extraordinary," in the voice of someone reporting a fact. Then Celeste, who stood across the green room with her arms crossed and looked at Amara with the expression of a woman who was feeling something significant and had made the professional decision to let it show. 20 years overdue, Celeste said. Exactly on time, Amara said. Oh Han-jai came through to congratulate her, and she thanked him and asked him quietly, "Any news?" And he said nothing tonight. "Tonight is for this," and she nodded. Her students Su-yan and Gina came through together. Su-yeon looked like she'd been crying, which she registered, and then did not acknowledge, because Su-yeon was a young woman who needed her dignity. Gina said, "The transition in the third movement," and stopped, and then said, "I've been playing for 15 years and I've never heard anything do that." And Su-yeon looked at the ceiling, and Amara said, "Keep practicing," and meant it in every possible way. She was moving through the remaining guests when she felt the quality of attention shift. She turned. Kwon Mi-suk was standing at the edge of the green room in a gray wool coat that cost more than most people's monthly rent. A sound like green wood splitting, with the particular upright posture of a woman who had spent 70 years in rooms where she was either the most important person present or had chosen to be comfortable being the second. She looked at Amara with dark eyes that held something Amara had not seen in them across 9 years of dinners and family gatherings and awkward holiday mornings, something direct and unguarded, and, underneath that, something that looked very much like acknowledgement. The room shifted slightly, the kind of shift that happens when people sense that something with weight is occurring and then reconfigured, creating a space between the two women that no one was occupying. Misal walked across it. She stopped in front of Amara and looked at her for a long moment without speaking, and Amara let her look because Kwon Mi-suk had earned the right to take her time. "I brought you something," Mi-suk said. Her voice was quieter than Amara had ever heard it. She reached into her coat pocket and took out a small ceramic object, which she pressed into Amara's palm. Amara looked down. A cup. Small, perfectly made, pale celadon with a faint crackle glaze, the kind of thing you'd find in a proper ceramic studio or a museum gift shop. Simple, chosen. "I know it is not the one that broke," Mi-suk said. "It isn't meant to be." She paused. "It is meant to be something that is yours from the beginning." Amara looked at the cup in her hand. She felt something arrive in her chest that didn't have a clean emotion word attached to it, grief and warmth, and the recognition of being seen by an unexpected source, all of it at once. The seen, particular layered way that things arrive, when you've been through enough that simple feelings have become rare. "Thank you," she said. Mi-suk nodded once, with the decisive satisfaction of a woman who has done the right thing and doesn't need it, commented upon further. Then she said quietly, "He is outside. He is not coming in unless you say so." She looked at Amara steadily. "He did not ask me to tell you. He doesn't know I'm telling you." Amara closed her fingers around the cup. "Tell him he can come in," she said. He came in the way he'd stood at the conservatory recital, not taking up space, positioned near the wall, which was so unlike the version of him that Seoul's business world experienced that it still registered each time as something that required adjustment. He was looking at her as he crossed the room, and he looked like himself, and he looked like someone she'd spent 9 years beside, and he looked like a person she was still in the process of figuring out how to know. The room had cleared, mostly. Danielle was visible at the far end, deeply engaged in conversations about something with enough apparent substance that it was probably at least partially designed to give the near end of the room some breathing room. Celeste was gone. The recording engineer was gone. The students were gone. Song stopped in front of her. He didn't say anything at first. He looked at her in the particular way he had, that she'd always read as calculation and had gradually come to understand was concentration, the full quiet weight of his attention when he was actually paying it. The ending, he said. The final passage. The way it opened instead of landing, he stopped. Start it again. I've been thinking about how to say this accurately. It felt like something that refuses to be finished. Like it's making room for whatever comes after it. Amara looked at him. That's exactly what it's doing, she said. He nodded. Once the nod of a man who has arrived at the right address. I got your text, he said. After the letter, I know. I read it. Thank you for writing it. He said the words back to her, not as repetition but as examination. I've been thinking about those 8 words for 6 weeks. What did you think? That they were honest, he said. And that they didn't give me anything I didn't deserve and didn't take away anything you needed. He paused. I've been trying to learn to identify what that looks like. The honest version without the performance on top of it. She looked at him. She had thought in the weeks before the concert about what she would feel when she saw him next, had run through the possible versions the way you run through scenarios when you're trying to prepare, as though emotional states can be prepared for. She'd expected grief, or anger, or the particular blunted affection of someone working through the aftermath of a long damage. She had not expected this, the clean, leveled feeling of being in the same room with someone and seeing them without the distortion of either resentment or need, seeing them as they were, flawed and changed and still themselves. She had not expected to feel like she was talking to a person she was choosing whether to know. You didn't have to let her go, she said. Hey, Rin. When the legal pressure came, you could have made the deal. It would have been easier. Easier isn't what I'm trying to do anymore. I know. She looked at her hands, the cup Mysuk had given her, still in her left hand, and the muscle memory of 2 hours of playing still faintly present in her right. That's why I told you not to. He looked at the cup. He recognized it. She saw him recognize it, saw the brief shift in his expression. He knew his mother's taste. She came tonight, he said. She did. He absorbed this without commenting on it, which was, Amara thought, the right response. I'm not asking to come back, he said. I understand that's not I understand what you built here. The apartment, the conservatory, the lawyer, the letter to Marcus Webb, the concert tonight. He looked at her steadily. You built all of this without the house and the name and the money and the security detail. I understand what that means, and I understand why going back inside that version of our life would undo the thing you just built. Then what are you asking? She said. He was quiet for a moment. I'm asking if there's a version of us that isn't that, he said. One we build from the position we're actually in. Not the position we were in 9 years ago, not a reconstruction of the marriage that broke, but something that starts here, from what we actually are now. He paused. I'm not asking for an answer tonight. I'm not asking for an answer this month. I'm asking if the question itself is something you're willing to hold. Amara looked at him. She thought about the composition, about the ending she'd written in a hotel room at 1 a.m, the ending that resolved without concluding, that opened instead of landing, that made room for whatever came after it. Soon splitting. She thought about what she'd been trying to say in that ending and whether she'd known when she wrote it what she was actually saying. I'm willing to hold the question, she said. Something shifted in his face. Not relief more specific than relief. The particular quality of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a long time and has set it down not because the burden is over, but because he's found the right place to put it, temporarily. That's enough, he said. 3 days after the concert, on a cold March afternoon that had the particular clean brightness of weather turning, without yet having turned, Amara and Danielle found a ceramic studio in Insadong. It was the kind of place that smelled like clay and mineral and the particular warm earthiness of a kiln recently used. The owner was a small woman in her 60s who spoke limited English and demonstrated the properties of each piece by holding it up to the window light, and the pieces were arranged on wooden shelves with the simple confidence of things that know what they are. Amara stood in front of a shelf of cups and looked at them. She picked up one that was plain and small and deep blue, almost the color of the dress she'd worn for the concert, a glaze that had pooled darker at the base and lighter toward the rim, the way glazes do, when they've been fired at exactly the right temperature by someone who knew what they were doing and let the process be what it was without forcing it. She turned it in her hands. It was not expensive. It was not extraordinary. A sound like it was a cup chosen on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon by a woman who had spent 4 months on a fold-out couch rebuilding the life she should have been living and who had performed the composition she'd been writing for 20 years to 1200. Standing people 3 days ago and whose name had been cleared from a criminal file it had never belonged in, and who was going to fly to London in 2 weeks to begin recording an album under her own name. She carried the cup to the counter. The owner wrapped it in paper. Danielle paid for her own cup, a wider, rougher, ochre-colored thing that looked exactly like Danielle, and they left the shop and walked out into the Insadong afternoon. The street was busy with the particular mid-afternoon energy of Seoul in early spring, and they walked without a specific destination, the way you walk on days that don't need to be going anywhere. After a while, Danielle said, "How are you actually?" Amara considered it honestly. "Good," she said. "The real version of good, not the performed version." "And Seong-hwan?" She walked for a moment before answering. "We had a conversation after the concert." She looked at the bag in her hand, at the paper-wrapped cup inside it. "He asked if we could build something new from where we actually are." Danielle was quiet, waiting. "I told him I'd hold the question," Amara said. "That's not a yes." "No, it's not a no either." "Also no." She adjusted the bag in her hand. "It's honest. I know what I did and didn't have in that marriage, and I know what it cost me to leave it and to build what I built in the past 4 months. I'm not going to walk back into anything that asks me to be less than what I am now." She paused. "But I also know that the person who was sitting in the back row, in the last seat on the aisle last night, was not the same person I left in October. And I know that the reason I know that is because of specific things he did, rather than things he said." "People change," Danielle said. "Occasionally." "Occasionally," Amara agreed, with evidence. They walked past a tea shop, with its window fogged from inside, past a street vendor selling dedokbokki to a pair of teenagers who were eating it, standing up with the casual appetite of people who consider pavement a valid dining location, past a bookshop whose window was arranged with the patient confidence of a place that believed in the product it was selling. "London in 2 weeks," Danielle said. "London in 2 weeks. And the album. And the album." Danielle looked at her sidelong. "And after all that?" Amara walked for a moment in the Insadong afternoon, with the cup in her bag and the composition still present in her hands, the way things are present for days after you've performed them. And she felt the question land and looked at the street ahead of them, the ordinary, beautiful, ongoing street of a city that was enormous and indifferent and completely capable of holding whatever was going to happen next. And she said, "After all that, I'll know better." In a smaller house in a quieter neighborhood, Kwon Mi-suk had an old grand piano near the window. Amara didn't know it was going to be there. She went to dinner 3 weeks after the concert on a Sunday evening because Mi-suk had called and asked her directly, not through Seong-hwan, not as a family obligation, as a direct invitation from one woman to another, and Amara had accepted because she was trying, carefully and without illusion, to practice the distinction between the life she'd left and the people inside it, who might deserve to be approached differently. Seong-hwan was there. They had spoken twice since the concert, once when he called to say the Hanamdong mansion had been officially sold, which he relayed not as a gesture but as information she deserved to have. Once when she called to tell him the album's recording sessions were beginning and they'd talked for an hour about things that had nothing to do with lawyers or letters or damaged years, just talked. 2 people without a specific agenda, which had felt strange, and then had stopped feeling strange. Dinner was the 4 of them, Amara, Seong-hwan, Mi-suk, and an aunt named Kwon Jong-hee, who appeared to be in her late 60s, and whose primary conversational method was candid observation, delivered with the comfort of a woman who had reached the age at which social filtration seemed like more trouble than it was worth. Jong-hee looked at Amara when she arrived and said, "You look like yourself," in a tone that implied this was a significant improvement over a previous condition, and Amara had decided immediately that she liked her. The food was Mi-suk's the real version, not catered, not delegated. the Galby gym that apparently required 6 hours and was produced with the matter-of-fact authority of a woman who had been making it for 40 years and considered commentary on the process unnecessary. They ate at a table that fit 4 people, the way tables in smaller homes fit 4 people, which was to say closely with the minor territorial negotiations of shared serving dishes and elbows that needed to be mindful of adjacent elbows, which was completely different from the managed formality of Hanam-dong dinners, and felt, Amara thought, like something a person could survive. After dinner, Mi-suk served tea, and Jong-hee was telling a story about a family trip in the 1980s that appeared to be primarily about how badly wrong a specific bus route had gone, and Amara was listening with genuine attention. And then she looked across the room and saw the piano. It was an upright grand old, dark wood, positioned near the window the way furniture gets positioned when it's been in a room for so long that it's become part of the room's understanding of itself. Not a prestigious instrument, not a Steinway, the kind of piano that exists in family homes because someone years ago believed the family should have a piano, and then the piano outlasted the belief and became simply itself. She looked at it. Mi-suk was watching her. "It was my husband's mother's," Mi-suk said. "I keep meaning to have it tuned." Amara looked at the piano for a moment. Then she set down her tea and crossed the room and sat on the bench. The bench wobbled slightly, one leg shorter than the others 2 degrees to the right, which was almost the same as Danielle's bench but opposite, which made her think about the particular symmetry of imperfect things. She smiled at the bench without meaning to. She pressed a key. Middle C out of tune. But not catastrophically, the pitch was warm and rounded rather than sharp, the particular detuning of an instrument that has aged well rather than one that has been damaged. There was a quality to it. She recognized the quality of something that has been waiting without resentment. She played the opening phrase of the composition, quietly below tempo, just the melody, 8 bars. The room went still. She played it again with her right hand and added the left, the full texture beginning to build, and she let it build slowly, moving through the first movement without rushing, finding the room's acoustics smaller than the sejong's center, warmer, the sound staying closer to her, and letting the music settle into the space it had, working with what was available rather than requiring the ideal conditions. Jong-hee had stopped telling her story. Mi-suk had set down her tea. Seong-hwan had not moved since she began playing. She reached the 3rd movement, the transitional passage. She played it the way she'd played it March 10th in front of 1,200 people, and the way she'd played it alone in the Sejong Center at 9 at night, and the way she'd played it on Danielle's out-of-tune upright at 4 in the morning. The first time it had properly opened, she played it the way it lived in her hands now, which was to say completely, without holding anything back for a better occasion, because there was no better occasion than the one currently available. She reached the ending, the new ending, the Heathrow Hotel ending, the one that opened instead of landed. She played it through to the final note. The note sounded in the small room, and then began to dissolve, the way all notes eventually dissolve, into the air that surrounds them, and then into the silence that was always going to be there on the other side. She sat with her hands in her lap. The room was quiet. Then Jong-hee said to no one in particular, "Well." And Mi-suk made a sound that was very short and very quiet, and might have been a laugh, and might have been something else. Amara looked toward Seong-hwan. He was not checking his phone. He was not speaking to anyone. He was not watching the door. He was sitting perfectly still in the chair across the room, with his hands on his knees, and his attention entirely present, not managed, not performed, just present. The way a person's attention is when something has arrived that they haven't heard before and they don't want to miss a single measure of it. He looked at her. She looked at him. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. There was nothing to say that the room hadn't already heard. She turned back to the piano. She placed her hands as on the keys. She began to play again something different this time, something shorter, a piece with no drama in it, just music in a room where people were listening. And outside the window, Seoul glowed in its ordinary, enormous way, indifferent and alive. And inside the room, 4 people sat with their tea and their silences, and the particular warmth of a small space that holds for a moment something larger than itself. And for the first time in 9 years, Amara played in a room where no one needed anything from her except the music. That was enough. That was finally everything.